Hi, and welcome to the Right to Remain Silent podcast. I'm Jim Weber, your host and guide through actual accounts of intriguing and fascinating true crime stories as told by the law enforcement professional that experienced the event. The Right to Remain Silent podcast makes no exaggeration of fact, doesn't glamorize details, or sensationalize reality. The format here is basic. Real stories from real cops. Lastly, please don't forget to like, follow, subscribe, and share. Doing this will help me continue to provide you, the listener, with captivating and relevant true crime stories. Now, let's listen in on today's episode. Hi, and welcome to today's episode of the Right to Remain Silent True Crime Podcast. I'm your host, Jim Weber, and today's guest is Alan Foust, former Missouri State Highway Patrol trooper, undercover operative, narcotics investigator, and supervisor. During his career with the Highway Patrol, Alan worked both long-term and short-term undercover narcotics investigations throughout the state of Missouri, as well as multiple states across the country. It's an honor to have you here today, Alan. I greatly appreciate you taking your time to speak with me about your career.
Thank you.
All right. I think what I'd like to do is I'd like to read your bio because I think it's helpful for listeners to know a little bit about you and understand where you're coming from here as we talk about law enforcement today. Would it be okay if I read your bio?
Sure.
All right, here we go. Alan Foust joined the Missouri State Highway Patrol in 1979, graduating from the 50th recruit class and beginning his career as a road trooper in Cape Girardeau. After 5 years on patrol, Alan transferred to the patrol's narcotics unit, where he conducted long-term undercover investigations across Missouri. Alan later served as supervising narcotics investigator for Troops E, Southeast Missouri, and Troop C in St. Louis. In 1989, Allen was tasked with establishing and supervising Missouri's first multi-jurisdictional drug task force, the Southeast Missouri Drug Task Force. Allen also reestablished the Mineral Area Drug Task Force. He additionally coordinated the patrol's narcotics training program at the Highway Patrol's Law Enforcement Academy in Jefferson City. Taught undercover operations and risk management to troopers and officers from across the state. In 1995, Allen transitioned to the private sector, founding a loss prevention and risk management firm. And over the next decade, he consulted with several Fortune 500 companies, specializing in workplace violence prevention and school safety. He's a certified protection professional and a member of the National Speakers Association. Alan, that is an incredible bio. Again, thanks for being here today.
I appreciate it. Thanks, Jim.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this. I'm curious to know why it was that you actually got into law enforcement and specifically why the Missouri State Highway Patrol. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I was 25 years old, and I basically got in between jobs. I wasn't really drawn to law enforcement. My family wasn't in law enforcement. We never talked about it, but I'd always admired the Missouri State Troopers. I was raised in an extremely rural area in southeast Missouri, and the local law enforcement at that time, this sounds crazy, but you could go to you could get a commission to be a law enforcement officer in the state of Missouri after 120 hours of training. So you go to school for 3 weeks and be a sheriff's deputy or a city police officer. Well, it was different with the troopers, and you could see that in our community when you were dealing with a sheriff's deputy, you never knew what quality of of service you were going to receive. And when the trooper
Sure.
showed up, he was going to take care of business. And I had some experiences when I was very young. I can remember one time I was traveling to my grandparents' house, and we were on US 60, and we're going along there between Dexter and Fisk, Missouri, and there's these highway patrol cars on the side of the road, and I look over and there's these troopers with their shotguns trained on this house, leaning into these shotguns, and I was probably 12 years old, and that's still emblazoned on my mind's eye. And those images never went away. So when I found myself in between jobs, I just it was actually impulse. I just went over to the troop headquarters there in Poplar Bluff and put in my application. And there was a legend sitting behind the chair. Everybody knew him. If I mentioned him today, his name was Paul Moore. He asked me what my dad's name was, and I told him. He said, "I'll sign your." At that time, someone had to sign your card to even initially uh, start the process. And he said, I know your dad." He said, "I'll sign your card." And so
Wow.
that's where it started. It was just this admiration for the blue shirts in our community, and the way they performed and the professionalism, and they were just a cut above anything else I'd ever seen.
Sure. Sure. Absolutely. And during that time frame, things were a little bit different then. I think you had mentioned in our preparation for today the number of applicants at the time frame when you applied for the highway patrol. I think it was something you had mentioned something along the lines of like 2,000 applicants during that time frame, and a small number from that were actually hired to go to the academy. Is that right?
Yeah, the patrol and state patrols and state police in general, they do a great job of vetting because there's always been a lot of applicants. There's not as many today, of course, with the culture that we live in. But yeah, there were 2,000. That's what they told me that's what they reminded us continually in the training. There was 40 people, 40 or 50 people that wanted that seat, and we're going to try to knock you out of it. But in fact, I didn't even make the first cut. I can remember I was shocked because anytime I ever went in to get a job anywhere else, I immediately had a job because I was a good worker and had a good background. And I applied for the patrol, and I didn't make the first cut. So I called to Jeff City and I said, what can I do better? What do I need to do? And I talked to some captain in the HR department. He said, "Well, let me look." And he pulled my record and he said, "There's not anything you can do." He said, "Your numbers are high." He said, "You'll make the next class." And it was just a numbers thing. So there was 2,000 applicants. There were 38, I think 38 guys that graduated from my class. It's not much different today. The patrol last year, they had 1,600 applicants and they graduated 53 troopers. And some of those troopers will be screened out, and you're on probation for 12 months. And some of those guys and girls they'll be screened out right on the road. So it's still very selective, as it should be.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you want quality candidates to fill a position like that.
Right.
So I would agree.
Yes.
And I got into law enforcement so I didn't have to do math, but you know, 2,000 applicants and around 40 positions, that's like a 2% selection rate. So
Yes.
that's
Yes.
that's incredible. All right.
Yeah.
Well, so at some point you do get hired and you do become a trooper, but as part of that process, there's the academy that you have to attend. Can you talk about that a little bit? Where was the academy? How long was it? And just kind of what was your general experience there?
Yeah, the Law Enforcement Academy for Missouri is in Jefferson City. They have a barracks there. It's actually a nice complex. They still use it today. It's multi-building, I should say. So they have barracks, and then they have the training building, which has they call it a training tank. It's actually an Olympic-sized swimming pool on the bottom, and the farms range, indoor farms range, and then they had a different building, separate building that's the administrative offices and the cafeteria. But it's 5 months long, and when you show it up on a Sunday night, and there's a sergeant sitting at the front desk, and the first mistake you make is not saying sir to him. I mean, And then you walk down to the cafeteria and they assigned you rooms. And I mean, it started on Sunday night. It was like somebody, I was 25 years old. I'd been around a little bit. I was married. My wife was pregnant. And it was like somebody just took their fist and hit me right in the forehead with it. I mean, that's how harsh it was. They got us up the next morning at, I don't remember, 6 a.m. and had us lined up in the gym and yelling at us. And I can remember there was one guy that he made the mistake. They told us what to show up and wear. And they said, wear white socks. Well, he had white socks. I just love this story. He had white socks with a yellow stripe around the top. And I'm going, you're an idiot. You know, you're an idiot. And sure enough, they started circling him like sharks circling chum in the ocean. And he fainted. And he goes down to the floor. And one of those sergeants, and there's like three of them out there in uniform and one in workout PT clothes with us. And this sergeant gets down on the floor with him and looks at him and says, crawl out that door. You throw up on this gym floor. He said, I'm going to kick your ass. And that poor kid crawled out the door and threw up outside. He was gone by Wednesday. He was gone by Wednesday. They screened him out immediately. But that first week, they called it Hell Week. And they basically tried to get rid of you. It was, at 3 o'clock, we had classes from 8 till 3. And at 3, they split the class in half. Half of us went down to firearms range, and half of us went to what they call PT. But it was really a series of exercises, and most of them two-person, to find every muscle in your body and just make it scream. And by the end of the week, there wasn't a place you could touch on your body that wasn't sore. And if you made it through that first week, you were probably going to make it through the academy, because it was pretty severe the first 4 to 6 weeks, and then they lessened the pressure. The classes became longer. There was college level classes. In the beginning, they had these. I remember talking to Terry Mills, was in my class, and he had just got out of the Marines. His dad was a trooper too, so he knew more than we knew. And I remember saying something. I said, if these guys don't quit yelling at me and get in my face and yelling, he said, well, at least they're not hitting you. And I went, hit me, they're going to hit me. But what he said, what's wearing me out are these tests. And so they had these classes on the smaller issues like first aid and Missouri history and Missouri State Highway Patrol history and drug identification. And they were an hour long. Well, the next day we'd have 8 tests a day. And if you
Mm.
flunked one of those, if you made less than, I forget now, 7%, I guess, 80%, you were in the library that night studying and you had to retake it. You couldn't flunk a test there. So there was this academic pressure on you, especially the first 2 or 3 weeks. You had to memorize all 114 counties and the county seats. And it's crazy. I mean, it was
I remember
absolutely,
somebody telling me that, and I'm like,
yeah.
I don't think I could even do that.
Yeah, well, you memorize them a little at a time, like a section at a time, but there was a lot of memorization. You had to memorize Chapter 43 of the Revised Missouri Statutes, which is all the traffic law. You literally memorize it line by line,
Mm.
because you have to. If you're going to enforce it, you have to know it.
Right.
So it was a wake up call for someone like me. At 5 o'clock, we all got back together and we ran 3 miles. Well, I immediately got shin splints. And so I went to my counselor. They assigned you a counselor, one of the cadre, and mine was Lieutenant Bergman. I was scared to death of him. And he said, well, you can't quit running. He said, just don't do anything on weekends. And he said, wrap your shins in warm towels, or you can bring a heating pad up here. And I had shin splints for 5 months.
Oh,
I couldn't quit. There
miserable.
was guys that graduated with broke ribs. One guy had a broke leg. When we'd run 3 miles, he'd have to go to the gym and ride a bicycle for 3 miles, but they didn't kick him out. He stayed with it.
Wow. Did you like going into it? Did you expect that? Did you
No,
have any
no,
idea, or was it a
no. I had
complete
no.
surprise?
No, I was completely surprised. I had no, I hadn't been in the military. Like a few of the guys had been in the military, they knew what was coming. There was one gentleman there. His name was Larry Locke, and he was a Jefferson City police officer before he was accepted. We would come over and watch him every day. So he was totally prepped. I mean, physically, he was locked and loaded when he hit the place. He knew exactly what he needed to do. But I had gone out and ran a little bit. I'd never been a runner. But I had no idea how to prepare. I lived 200 miles from Jeff City, so it wasn't like I could, and I didn't talk to anyone. That was probably one of my biggest mistakes, was not talking to anyone about what can I do to prepare for this. But the state police and state patrols are quasi-military organizations. When one of the things we did in the morning, we would march for a half an hour, and we got really good at it. The guy that got us up in the morning and put us to bed, he was a former Marine, a drill sergeant, and he knew how to march. And you learned how to march, how to stand at attention, how to go to port arms.
Hmm.
I mean, it was, and in the beginning, I had no idea. I can still remember them yelling at me, "You don't know your left from your right, Faust, get in the back," but I learned pretty quick. You learn pretty quick.
Right, right. Did you know anybody going into the academy?
Oh, no.
Would you have any friends, or did you just go in and everybody was a stranger?
Everyone was a stranger. You became close friends with certain ones. Like there was one gentleman from Bloomfield. His name was Mike Kingery, and we rode back and forth together. And then there was a couple more from Southeast Missouri, and we rode together and shared the same transport up to Jeff City and back. You would go up, Sunday nights. You had to be there Monday morning first thing, and then we were released Friday afternoon at usually 4 or 5 o'clock. So, I mean, all you thought about was quitting. That's it in a nutshell. Everybody thought about quitting all the time. We actually talked people out of quitting. Mike Kingery was one of them. He had a bunch of kids. He had 4 kids. He just missed them so much. But the hardest thing was going back up there every Sunday, driving, making that drive, and you just would get this feeling in the pit of your stomach. And that didn't go away. I mean, I can still remember after I became a trooper, I'd have to drive up to Jeff City and get a car or something, and I would drive over the hill and I'd see general headquarters on the hill, and I would actually still get that sick feeling in my stomach.
Oh,
It was a
wow.
just a reaction. It
Yeah.
was hard on someone like me who had not been exposed to any kind of military training. And that's why, I mean, today, again, in the culture we live in, they'll start a class of, usually they're truncated, the classrooms are set up for 40. They might have 30 or 35, and they'll lose half of them. They'll lose half of them. And that didn't happen during my time. You didn't. And the other thing that didn't happen, if you made it through the academy, you were probably going to make it on the road. And today, talking to my son is a trooper. Both my sons are in law enforcement. And I remember going to his graduation, and I could pick out 2 or 3 now troopers in the group, and I said something to him. I said, "Those don't look like troopers." He said, "Well, they won't make it 12 months on the road." So they were going to
Hmm.
be screened out on the road. That didn't happen in my time. If you made it to the road, you were going to be a trooper.
You were
It
solid.
was
You made it.
rare. It was rare to lose an officer on the road in that probationary period.
Okay. All right. That's interesting. So you successfully complete the academy and graduate from it. And then what happens there? You have an initial assignment, correct? A certain area of the state. You patrol the road. Talk to us about that a little bit.
Yeah, I was fortunate. I got assigned to the Cape Girardeau zone, Cape Girardeau, Missouri zone here in Southeast Missouri. I still live here today. It's an excellent assignment. It was coveted by officers. I just happened to draw it because there was an officer that was transferred out of the zone for a mistake he made. And so there was this hole. I was actually slated to go to Hayti, which that zone never stays full down in the Boot Hill. So a trooper goes there from almost every class. And right at the last minute, this trooper gets disciplinary transferred out of this zone. So I drew Cape, and it was a strong zone. The guy with the least amount of time on, who was my field training officer, he had 7 years on. And then there was a couple guys that came on, had come on 2 years before him. So they had 9 years. So it was a very veteran zone. At that time in this troop, there were 7 zones, and which means there were 7 zone sergeants, and they all had gray hair. I mean, you didn't mess with these zone sergeants. They ran their zones. Even the troop captain really didn't tell the zone sergeants at that time
Hmm.
period how to run their zones. They were like gods in the zones that we had at that time. And this zone consisted of Cape Girardeau, Boulder County, and the top half of Scott. So it was actually it was a large zone too to work.
Pretty large area.
But yeah, but I had some very good trainers, good mentors. I had a sergeant that taught me the black and white, cross the T's, dot the I's. I had a corporal that would was a legend on the patrol. His dad had been a trooper. His brothers were troopers. And he would just get in the patrol car with me once in a while, and we'd stop for coffee. And he, instead of getting in his car, he would get in my car, and we'd drive around. He'd say, "So, how's the wife doing?" Or, "What's your job here?" And I'd say, "Well, to enforce traffic laws and promote safety on the highway. It's in chapter 42, memorize it." He said, "No, no, no, no." He said, "You're in the people business. You deal with people out here." So he took care of the soft side, and then my field training officer kept me from getting hurt for the first, you ride with your field training officer for 3 months, and basically he keeps you from getting killed. I mean, that's
Hmm.
really what it boils down to.
Sure. Sure. So what you're a 25-year-old guy, you're just starting out in law enforcement. What was it like working the road as a young new trooper like that? Was it exciting? Was it what you expected?
I think so. I enjoyed it. I liked it. I liked the not knowing what was going to happen. I could pull up to the top of the roadway, and whether I turn right or left on Old 61 would dictate my evening. It was, I thought that was interesting because I could turn right and maybe I run into this situation that night, or if I turn left, it'd be a completely different scenario. It was always for chance. It was stressful the first year. The zone was always one or two men short. So I I work occasionally. I work a Friday or a Saturday night by myself, and if that happened, if there wasn't two troopers on, all you were going to do was go from call to call to call. And I remember having a knot in my stomach every Friday night that I worked by myself. Now, if there was another trooper on, a veteran trooper, I did that knot was not there. But what you learned what you learned pretty quick was I can muddle through anything. I can, because of my training, my background, the guidance I'm getting here in the zone from these other veteran officers, I can muddle through anything. So, I got through that first year without getting hurt, and didn't make any big mistakes. And then after that first year, it's kind of like everything falls into place. A three-year trooper, the way I look at a 3-year trooper is seeing everything, and a 5-year trooper, he can handle anything. Now you get to a 10-year trooper, and he or she makes it look easy. They make it look easy. Now that's in a nutshell what my perception of a good state officer working the road. That's what you're seeing. That that first year trooper, uh, he has a lot of oversight, but they don't tell you what to do. One of the things I loved about the patrol was I would make a mistake, and I would talk to my corporal most of the time because he was softer than the sergeant, and he'd say, and I'd ask if I did it right. He said, "Well, what do you think?" And they would never tell you to they would never tell you you did something wrong. They would never tell you to write more tickets, write less tickets. There was no numbers game in the zone that I was in. And I didn't see it in the troop, but they wanted you to go out there and work. They wanted your presence. I can remember my field training officer saying, if you're just sitting in the median, you're working. You can just sit in the median because people see you and they see your presence, and that's important. So another one of the zone members told me that he ran every road in his zone. Now that's 2.5 counties at least once a month. So
Hmm.
every blacktop, and I thought, now there's a good guide. That's good. Because you see differences in the road, you see things that have changed, and you come across someone that needs to be stopped. You come across a
Sure.
guy that's running tags on a single set of tags on two vehicles, for instance, or just little stuff like that. But
Right.
what the public doesn't understand, if in this zone, and zones are different, but you could make 20 car stops, and that 20th car stop, you're going to get something. You're going to get a stolen car. You're going to get a bad guy. You're going to get a guy that needs to go to jail that night. You're going to get a drunk. I've stopped cars for a license violation, and the guy steps out of the car and falls down. He said, "I can't walk, but I can drive." because he's,
Right.
have had that happen. So people don't understand I use the example of Charlie Hanger. Charlie Hanger, does that ring a bell?
It does. It does.
An Oklahoma trooper out there on a lonely interstate doing his thing, and he makes a car stop, and by the next day they find out that he has locked up the Oklahoma bomber.
Yep.
And because he's just doing his job, he's just out there making a
Right.
car stop, just like a trooper does, and he makes what I consider the stop of the decade. I mean, that's the car stop of a decade, just doing his job, and he stops the guy that did the Oklahoma bombing.
Yeah. Yeah. That's incredible. And that's a great point. I think oftentimes public looks and sees a police car or a patrol car sitting in the median. They're like, they're just out writing tickets. That's not the case. There's so much more to it. And those are great points.
Yeah.
So you worked about what, 5 years or so in
Uh,
patrol?
Probably just less than 5 years on the road.
Okay. And then at some point, you transition and you move to narcotics investigations, right?
Yeah, I was in a training session in Jefferson City, and I went down to the basement room, which is kind of at the barracks, and I went down there to get a soda or watch some TV or something, and I ran into one of my classmates, Joe Crump, and he's on the pay telephone. There's back the time pay telephones, and he's got long hair, and he's trying to grow a beard. He's part Indian, so he can't grow facial hair. He's trying. But I thought, what is he? So I said, Joe, what are you doing? He said, well, come down here. And at that time, the patrol narcs had two rooms way back in the basement of the academy that they were allowed to use. And so he takes me down there, and he pulls out his briefcase, and he's bought some drugs that night in Columbia, Missouri, and he transitioned to narcotics within 3 years. And he was an unorthodox. I went through recruit school with him, so he's unorthodox there. He would come in on Sunday nights with alcohol in his breath. I'm going, oh my God, I mean, I was raised Baptist, you just didn't do stuff
Right.
like that. But anyway, he transitioned to narcotics, and so I didn't forget that. It was kind of in the back of my mind. So the patrol that was 19. Let me think about this for a second. So in 1983, the legislature passed a bill that created the Division of Drug and Crime Control. Before that, on the patrol didn't have a formal investigative arm. It was very informal, and this codified that arm of the patrol. So they were looking to expand the narcotics section. So the captain at that time, his name was Melvin Duckworth, scary guy. But Captain Duckworth was trying to figure out, how do I get narcs? So he went to the troop captains, and he said, what if I borrowed some guys temporarily? So that came out in a memo or something. I thought, you know what? I'm going to try that. And the reason I did it was because I wanted to be a better road trooper. That was the only reason I went to
Hmm.
narcotics. I thought, yeah, I can get this experience in narcotics, and I can come back to the road and be a better trooper. And I was accepted. Me and Gary Wilson, and who was a classmate, and then another trooper by the name of Rick Lisby. And he was from the Raleigh area. So we were accepted as temporaries, and we worked 1 year and we were supposed to go back to the road. So anyway, we got in, and Gary hooked up. I think him and Rick worked together down at the lake, and it was an FBI-driven investigation. They had some FBI money. They were after some target, which never did come to fruition. But they did a pretty good investigation of the lake, and the patrol was just finishing up a narcotics investigation at in Rolla. So I scabbed onto the end of that, and they assigned Terry Mills to be my trainer, and he was finishing up in Southwest Missouri. So, so there was kind of a transition there of a month or two. I really didn't know what I was doing, but Terry stayed pretty close to me while I was working in Rolla. I'd go down there at night and then come back and stay in Jeff City for the evening. Did that for a few months, but our assignment was the whole troop of G, which is the South Central Missouri. and we started a long-term investigation there in, I think, February of 1985, a long time ago. I'm an old guy, but we started a long-term investigation there, and that was the beginning of my real undercover work, my undercover stint.
Okay. Well, what are your thoughts on this? Before we kind of drill down on your undercover career and specifics on that, I think there's kind of an interesting story to the overall undercover program or the narcotics program with the Highway Patrol. Would you maybe want to discuss the overall history or legacy of the narcotics unit of the patrol?
Yeah, the neat thing, the cool thing about the Highway Patrol to me is it's relatively small. I mean, there's smaller patrols in the United States, and Nevada would be a good example. But it's you get to know everyone, and uh, so you can actually link the beginning of the narcotics and the narcs to the end, what's current today. The first narc on the patrol, his name was Bob Ashurst. He came in 1970, and he's still around today. And what
Wow.
I consider one of the last narcs, one of the, would be considered, I hate to use the word legend, but I don't know a better word, but is right down here in Southeast Missouri's Travis Templemeyer. So you can connect 55 years, 56 years of history within the narcotics section. It wasn't that large. It was never that large, but it started with Bob Ashurst, and then those of note would be Eddie Lee Porter came in almost immediately after him, and then Ed Moses is another person of note. Ed, I spent had lunch with him the other day, and he's 81 years old, and he still works and gives programs, educational programs on drugs and narcotics. He's 81 years old.
Wow.
So now, and I'm not saying that there wasn't others that come and went, because there were
Sure.
for shorter periods, or and some of them I wouldn't know, but the ones that I'm mentioning are again they connected. There's some continuity there. There's a legacy there. About the time Eddie Moses stepped out, he was there for 5 years, 5.5 years, I think he said. John Vickers came in, and he was one of the characters and one of the finest undercovers the Missouri State Highway Patrol ever had. And I could share. I'd love to share this one story about John Vickers, for instance. Was that okay? Or
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah,
Please
okay.
do.
So this is the John Vickers story, and we could spend 2 hours just on John or Eddie Lee Porter, but I'll just tell you this story about John. So John, he's a football player. He's up at Kirksville, and he's graduating, and he's trying to find a job as a coach because he wants to coach football. And he said, you just at that, and during that time period, I think this was 19. Let me think about this for a second. This would have been about 1980. I can't remember the year now, but it'll probably come to me. But anyway, he wanted to be a coach, and
Hmm.
he takes his criminal justice class, and he can't find a job. And this guy says, "Well, the Highway Patrol's hiring." So he's 23 years old. He puts in for the Highway Patrol, and he gets it. Goes to the academy. He said, "I was not your model recruit." He was constantly in trouble, and I mean, just a good word is unorthodox. So he makes it through the academy. He gets assigned to an interstate zone on I-70 outside of Kansas City. And all those guys do is work the interstate. I mean, and it's a numbers thing, you know. And he has this hard bitten sergeant. And he said, so I'm out there writing tickets. And he said, I guess I would probably quit, because he said it was just so boring. It wasn't my cup of tea. And he said, but then I read this book called Super Cops. He said it's about these two New York, and I looked it up. You can still find it. If you've got an original copy, it's worth over $100.
Holy
But there's
smokes.
these two New York cops, and during the day they would work the road, and at night they would go out and do this stuff. And John said, he said to myself, I can be a super cop. So he lives in Odessa, and so he goes he's coaching a team there, you know, in his off time, and he goes to some of the boys, and he said, does anybody bring drugs in? This would have been about 1975, 76, right through
All
there.
right.
And they said, yeah, this guy comes in from Blue Springs, a suburb of Kansas City, every once in a while, and he brings drugs into town. And he said, well, the next time they come, you call me. So he said, in less than a week, he said, these farm boys, they're just farm boys. They call me and say, hey, that guy's in town. He said, well, come by and pick me up. And he's working the road. John is working the road. He goes home. He changes into rough clothes, checks the radio, makes sure he has no calls. He's the only one on. And these farm boys come by and pick him up. He gets in the back of their pickup. And he said, I have no money. So he said, these farm boys, they always have a little money. I borrow money from these farm kids. And he said, we'll go out and meet this guy. He's wanting to sell me a lid. He said, I don't even know what a lid is. It's an ounce of marijuana. And so he buys $15 worth of marijuana. And then he draws down on the guy. Badgie said, you know how far that went? He said, he ain't no cop. And he said, listen, he said, I'm going to try not to kill you, but I'm going to shoot your ass off if you don't lay down on the ground. He said, I don't have handcuffs. He said, I get some rope out of this pickup and I tie him up. And he hauls him back to the county seat and locks him up, thinking he's going to be a hero the next day with his own sergeant. That didn't happen at all. He got in big trouble. But that's a typical John Bicker story. He goes back to his house and changes back, goes out, check the radio, make sure he hasn't got a call. I mean, just crazy stuff.
Yeah.
But I could
Yeah.
tell John Bicker stories. But in the beginning, the way the patrol was very fragmented in the way they were getting a lot of phone calls from uh, sheriff's offices and prosecutors saying, we got this drug problem in our town. How can we handle it? What can you do for us? So their answer was to pull a couple of guys, off the road and say, you're narcs. Bob Ashurst went to an undercover school, and at that time it wasn't DEA, it was BNDD, Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous
Yeah.
Drugs, and it was 6 weeks long. It was a substantial school. So they got a little bit of training, but they had no money. They would take a highway patrol car, put a vinyl top on it, the garage would. The garage has always been good to the narcs. They do whatever you want them to do to an undercover car. And they take the antennas off of it, plug the holes, and they used patrol cars for undercover. And
Wow.
then they would get money from the sheriffs, which that didn't work out real well because, as you know, or as an undercover, it should be on a need to know basis. Well, if the sheriff knows there's an investigation in his county, he's probably going to share it with someone.
Right.
So that didn't work too good. There was one story that was told, and this is a true story. Bob Ashurst in Springfield, Missouri, comes across some LSD, needs $80, goes to his mom and borrows money from his mom. They used to steal from the coffee fund or they would pool their money.
Hmm.
So they just didn't have any kind of plan on how to work narcotics. What they had was some motivated uh, troopers that figured out if you take and you reverse that. Eddie Lee Porter said this thing. He said, what if you went into your typical corner welfare bar and you pulled a guy out and you said, hey, we want you to infiltrate the Missouri State Highway Patrol. We're going to give you 2 weeks training and here's your uniform. So you train this guy and you send him into the Missouri Highway Patrol to infiltrate the Missouri Highway Patrol. How well would that go? So you're
Wow.
doing the reverse of that. You're taking a guy off the road, taking him out of uniform, sending him to a 2 week school and said, go out here and infiltrate the drug culture. That's not easy stuff.
No, not at all. Not at all. Huh. That's a great point. And you answered, you answered one of the questions I was going to ask, why the patrol felt they needed to dedicate a narcotics group. So that makes sense. What back at the time the narcotics group started, was it you mentioned in 1983 DDCC was formed. Was the narcotics group called DDCC? Was that part of DDCC back in the beginning?
You mean before the division? Before the division
Yes.
was formed?
Yeah.
No, that was the group was called I, Intelligence and Investigation. That's kind of an oxymoron, right?
Yeah.
But and then you had these narcs and the bomb unit, and the technical group was assigned to that that unit, and that was really it. And then each troop captain had two investigators, but they belonged to that troop captain. So the troop captains kind of had the power. And what happened when the division was formed and established, it reversed that. Those troop captains fell under, even though they stayed in the troop and stayed in the out Missouri area, they were actually controlled through the Division of Drug and Crime Control. So it formalized the division. But in the beginning, you had these narcs that sometimes they even worked under the troop captain. I can remember John Vickers saying that um, in the beginning he was in the Troop A area, Kansas City area, and he worked for I&I. And then one day they asked him how long he worked undercover, and it was like 5.5 years. They said, "Well, you've got to get out. We've got to send you back to the road." He said, "That's fine." So they sent him down to Springfield. He says on a Sunday afternoon, he sits down with the captain, and he said, I'm just going to have you ride with the zone sergeant for a month or 2 months, whatever it takes, and let you transition uh, back to the road over time, no rush here, no pressure. And he said, I get back to my apartment. He wasn't married at the time, I think he said. And he said, I get a call to come back to the office within an hour. And he said, there's a DE agent, ATF agent that he worked with in Kansas City, Harley Sparks and Steve Castillo. I know both of them. And they said, hey, how would you like to work undercover in the Springfield area? And the troop captain looks at him and says, they don't need to know what you're doing in Jeff City. He said, I'll just keep you on the schedule. So he actually fell under the troop captain as an undercover. I mean, that's how splintered it was. There was no rhyme or reason. The only thing that really kept it together, in my opinion, is that you had individuals who had been highly vetted in the beginning as patrolmen, had the had 6 months of training, 5 months of training at that time before overtime or comp time, or they
Hmm.
could work you as long as they wanted to, and then had spent 3 to 5 years on the road, so they knew right from wrong. They knew how to operate by themselves. They knew the law. So they transitioned over to this undercover position, and they still had that very solid foundation as a law enforcement officer. You couldn't have done it any other way. And there was narcs that lost their way. There was narcs that lost their way during that legacy time,
Hmm.
that time we're talking about, but few and far between.
Yeah. How, you know, it it everything starts at some point, and you just described how that the origin there. Was there a certain amount of time, or at what point did there become like structure to the narcotics program? Do you know what I'm trying to say? There was structure before, but like when did it become official and monitored and there's regulations and that type of thing? You see what I'm trying to get at?
Yes, yes. Where there was actually policy, there were GO
Yeah,
orders,
yes.
um, general orders, I should say. Yeah, I mean that would have started happening in 1983. There was no, and then even at that time, since there were so few of us, uh, it was still it's still a cowboy world, but
Sure.
the structure was there. There was money there most of the time. We had pretty good cars. We used pickups mostly, but you were very loosely supervised. There was
Yeah.
a tremendous amount of trust. I can remember the captain coming back one time, and he'd say, "What about this trooper?" And he named him, and he was a classmate of three of the guys in the room. We had some classmates that matriculated to the narcotics unit just because of I guess we knew each other, But anyway, I remember Gary Wilson looked up and says, "That guy's still in the highway patrol," and kept said, enough said. So we brought people in that were peer reviewed. I mean, that's how people got selected for the narcotics unit when I was there. I don't know if that's the best way or not, but you
Yeah.
could, if the guy said we don't need him in here, he didn't get in.
Yeah.
So I'm not quite answering your question.
No, I
They
think
had
you
they had
kind of
figured out
covered
by
it.
that time that they wanted troop-wide investigations. So you would be assigned a troop that wasn't the troop where you resided.
Hmm.
And you would go in usually in the beginning of the year, January, February, kind of set up shop, kind of figure out the troop itself. And the troops consisted of anywhere from 8 to, I think, 14 counties. There's 9 troops in the state of Missouri. And the only people that knew you were there was the troop captain and the 2 investigators. Usually there were only 2, sometimes 3 investigators in the troop. So nobody else knew you were there. Even your wife didn't know where you were working, which is pretty
Hmm.
crazy.
Yeah.
And you worked undercover for till about the end of the year, usually to November, right before Thanksgiving, and then you were told to shut it down most of the time, and you started shutting it down, and then there would be, you put those cases in the bank, and you would build these arrest books for each county, which were pretty elaborate. I was pretty impressed when we built the first one. I saw the first one built, and then you would go around to the prosecutors, or usually the local investigator would, the state investigator, and hand out these arrest books to the prosecutors in each county. They were thoroughly impressed because everything they needed was right there in this book. And then those people were arrested on arrest day, which was a big deal. And
Yeah.
then you would spend the next um, sometimes sometimes 2 months in court, sometimes all day. You would go from one county to the next county, all preliminary trials. You rarely went to trial, but everybody wanted to see the narc. So people would come from freaking 50 miles around, 100 miles around to court day and sit in the back of the courtroom and say, oh, we need to stay away from that guy.
Yeah.
But the court could get pretty intense, but that's kind of the way the investigations were arranged at that time. Not the best way to do it, but it did one thing. It made us really, really good at undercover. I mean, you make 2 or 3 buys a day. Sometimes you wouldn't make one for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
But if everything was lined up and if you had informants, one of the things though the investigators at the troop level would do is try to turn informants for you. And as you well know, you live and die by your informants.
Right.
So sometimes you got a really, really good one, and you'd rock and roll. And sometimes you worked cold without an informant, and sometimes you had a weak informant. But the more informants you had, the more, and that was one of the things that happened in my first long-term investigation is I remember we had over like a 9-month period, we had 5 informants that popped up at different times, and none of them burned us, which was really good. So,
Yeah.
so that's kind of the way it was, and there was a structure to that, and there was supervision. We had a sergeant out of Jeff City that would monitor us. You called in at night when you got done, and to recorder. That was your backup. You call into recorder, and the sergeant, your sergeant, the lieutenant, and the captain a lot of times would check that recorder in the mornings to make sure everybody had checked in the night before.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's interesting to see how it originated and then kind of how it grew and and became even more productive. And you said something earlier about I think it was DEA or ATF had approached one of the troopers about working undercover. For them, it was the trooper that you were talking about that was going to go back to the road, and they approached him and said, "Hey, you want to work for us?" And that brings up a great point. I think back during the time frame that you worked narcotics with the patrol, federal agencies like DEA and ATF utilized patrol undercovers quite a bit, right?
Yeah, like I said, I think that we did so much of it. That's all we did. We didn't realize at the time, but that's we were good at it. And so consequently, I can't remember a time that there wasn't a patrol undercover assigned to the FBI auto theft unit in St. Louis. There was all full time. There was, as long as I can remember, there was a trooper assigned to that. If a good example was the example that I gave in Springfield, Missouri, is John Vickers had worked for ATF and DEA, basically making their undercover cases. Um, we just did a lot of undercover, and so the federal agencies they leaned on us for that expertise. When 911, or not 911, but when the Oklahoma bombing occurred, um, the only the only law enforcement organization in the country, apparently. I'm not 100% on this, but the only organization that had an undercover in a right wing, uh, working undercover in a right wing uh, outfit was the Missouri State Highway Patrol. The FBI, they kind of yin and yang according to who the director is,
Right.
and so sometimes they do undercover, sometimes they don't. It's just according to the way the wind's blowing.
Right.
And so we were actually working long-term undercover in a right-wing group during the Oklahoma bombing and apparently averted a second bombing. Now, again, that was on a need-to-know basis. I wasn't in that
Right.
loop. But and then we had, the depth and the breadth of the undercover that the patrol did is, if you look at it from a bird's eye view, is totally fascinating. I mean, we've had guys in right wing groups sometimes for over a decade. One guy, and I'm not going to go into any names here, protect
Mm. Right.
those people, but we did murder for hires. We bought a lot of things besides drugs. We bought guns. We bought cars. Uh, I mean, it's interesting what you come across when you're in an undercover role. Again, I go back. I hate to keep talking about John Vickers, but he bought drugs from a person that was living in the governor's mansion while he was working undercover, and he
Wow.
was a national from an African country, and he just pops up in John's radar, and he's actually buying drugs in the governor's mansion. And
That's
of course, Governor
unbelievable.
Security they just went, and the governor's office didn't want to be embarrassed. It's really kind of an interesting story, and I will tell the whole story because of politics. But that happened. I mean, he bought drugs in the governor's mansion. It's crazy.
Wow. Wow. And that's a great point. Before we again get into your specifics, the patrol, you and I, you mentioned some very interesting cases that the patrol has worked. And, I had not heard that one about the governor's office, but, you had mentioned a case where a state trooper had worked a case, I think it was in Iron County with a judge, where the judge was trading sexual favors for leniency in traffic violations. Is that
Yeah,
right?
yeah, this one case popped up. Joe Crump came across that was his area, and we had a very effective undercover female. She's, she didn't look like a trooper. She's 5 foot nothing and weighed nothing, and cute as a bug's ear, and she and fearless, absolutely fearless. And so Joe set her up, and she went in and made this case on this judge that was trading favors. I mean, obviously she stopped it at the right point,
Right.
but the judge lost his job. I don't know. I don't know what the outcome of that was, if he was
Mhm.
prosecuted or not. But obviously, he needed to be stopped, and the patrol stopped it through undercover work. Yeah.
Yeah, and let's kind of stay on in this arena here, talking about some of the, important cases that patrol has worked. You've mentioned that there were undercover troopers that worked gang investigations, outlaw motorcycle gangs, where I think it was they infiltrated the El Forsteros motorcycle gang, which is a prominent 1% gang, right?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I'll talk about that investigation for just a minute. I was on my second undercover long term in Macon, Missouri, and Terry Mills and I were supposed to work that. And this informant became available in the St. Louis area through ATF. ATF had this informant that was close to the Alpha Steros, a one percenter gang sanctioned by the Hells Angels. And so anyway, they decided to use the patrol to do the undercover. So Gary Wilson, who had road bikes, kind of fit in, had a Harley. Um, they decided to use him, and Terry, he roped Terry, and they were pretty close. And so initially, I had this great pickup that would you could put a Harley. It didn't have a box or anything, so you could actually get a Harley up in the back of it. So Gary goes and gets an undercover plate for his motorcycle. They take my truck, which means I had to go get another undercover vehicle, and they put that Harley in the back of that truck, and they start running with this informant. And they've got an ATF backup team, a surveillance team watching them, and it starts to evolve a little bit, and then they kind of got stuck. And when you got stuck in investigation, you would call Joe Crump. And we call him the master. We say, hey, give us an idea. We're trying to get in on these people. And usually he'd have to sleep on it. But the next day he'd have an idea. And so he calls back the next day. He says, try this. And I'm not going to share that because
Yeah.
it'd be a giveaway. But anyway, they did, and it got him in. This informant was weak anyway. So they work out the informant. So the next thing you know, it's like all they're doing is hauling this Harley around in this truck. They got to do so Terry decides to buy a Harley. So this is where you kind of run out of money too. So a bunch of us go and check out buy money, and we give it to Terry. We give state money to Terry so he can buy a motorcycle. Now he paid us back eventually, he got his money, but he didn't have enough money to buy a motorcycle. He goes and gets an undercover plate for it, and so now they can ride motorcycles into St. Louis. And now they got something going.
Sure.
But I guess there's 2 points there. Number one is you figure out how to make that happen. How do we get another Harley into the investigation? Well, we just used buy money, and that's how unsupervised were. They didn't audit our buy money very closely.
Yeah. Yeah.
But anyway, we made that work, and Terry and Gary started riding with these guys to the point that ATF finally said, "We can't follow you anymore. We can't keep up with you." And they ended up running and riding with him. Gary was even best man in one of the guys' weddings
Wow.
before it was
The
all over.
trooper was the best man in a one percenter's wedding.
Yeah, yeah. They had a bar across the river. I went over there with them one time. I just had to go over and spend some time with them. And Froggies, there's probably people that might know that bar, but they owned it. The Alpha Stars owned that bar. And there was a guy there. His name was one of the bikers' names. They made a case with this guy's name was Gary Santos, and he was one of the enforcers. And you could tell when he had a gun. Usually, the woman with him would carry the gun in her purse, but he would carry a pair of jersey gloves in his back pocket. So you knew that day he had a gun. They'd wand you when you walked into this bar, and if you had a gun, they wouldn't say anything. You could go in with a gun, but they would still wand you. I never did get that. But it was a scary investigation because of the level of danger um, in that investigation. I mean, bikers are scary by nature anyway, and they live by their own code. And that was a significant investigation. And they ended up taking out. I don't remember now. I've actually got the teletype in one of these pictorial books that I put together. But they took out a half a dozen of the primary uh, members of that biking gang. Kind of broke their back. Yeah,
Yeah, that's an effective number,
yeah.
to take out of an organization like that. And what I'm hearing you say is from the onset of the narcotics and undercover program with the patrol until, today, it's just been an instrumental program in combating crime across Missouri. And I find it very interesting how you guys were routinely working investigations with federal law enforcement. So,
Hmm.
I mean, that just goes to the point we had touched on earlier is, a patrol car sitting in the median, there's more to the highway patrol than just that. And a lot of bad guys have been put away based off your narcotics and your undercover program. That's super impressive.
Yeah. And another point to that is, and it's easy to miss this, but a criminal is a criminal is a criminal. And the definition of a criminal is a guy that gets up every morning and says, what crime am I going to commit today? What person am I going to victimize? What Missourian am I going to victimize today? So you can use narcotics investigation. A lot of times I can remember I made a case on a guy, and it's on raid day, and he's sitting over in the corner in handcuffs, and he signals me over. He realizes now he's been done. And he says, Alan, he said, I'm not a drug dealer. And I bought a small amount of drugs from him. I don't remember. It's been too long ago. And I said, I know you're not, but I said, you're a professional burglar. And I said, so I've made a case that'll get you out of off the streets because you go around and you burglarize some people. He had a great system. He would drive around. He taught his sons. He'd drive around, and if they saw hunting dogs outside, they knew there were hunting guns inside. So
Huh.
they drive right up the house, knock on the door. If no one was home, they would, if they see an alarm system, they'd take the ladder off the side of the house and crawl up to the second floor, go in, throw the guns out. I mean, they had a great system. But
Wow.
the thing is, a criminal will they commit crimes, and it's not they don't confine themselves just to drugs. So, uh, and the quick and easy way to take out a guy like that is I give you money, you give me drugs. Hey, that's a violation. That's a felony.
Right.
So it was an easy way to make a case on a criminal that needed to be taken off the street. Not that that's always the way it happened, but it could happen, and you could make it happen.
Yeah. Yeah. Great point. Well, we've talked about the patrol, their program in general, and some instrumental cases and some other players. Let's break down your career. Kind of maybe walk us through, your entry into the narcotics and undercover world and talk about your first stint in narcotics. Would that be okay?
Sure. I would start with my first long term, and Terry Mills, who was a great undercover officer, one of the best. He was my break-in officer, and they called him the Tasmanian Devil because he just didn't slow down. I mean, he would set up as many bodies of the day as he could, or at least try, you know. And I can remember the guy. I can remember Joe Crump saying, "You never keep up with him," which was just a challenge for me. I just gritted my teeth. And I said, "I will maintain." So he had finished up his first long term in Southwest Missouri, made a few mistakes, decided things he wanted to do different in the West Plains area or the South Central Missouri, and they hadn't been worked in a long time in an undercover investigation. So they were kind of ripe, really. And that's at that time, uh, marijuana was the target. I mean, and they're famous for it. It's called Ozark Gold. They're famous for their marijuana there. They know how to grow it. They know how to use it. They know how to market it. They're just great with marijuana. That's what they're good at. And people from all over the Midwest and even as far away as Michigan would come in the fall, and they would go through the. I went to a gathering one time where there's guys that are from other states just going down the tables and picking out what he wanted to take back home with him. It's pretty amazing. But
Wow.
anyway, so we set up an undercover apartment in West Plains. And the first thing you do, excuse me, is you identify the bars that these people are running. At least that's the way we worked then. And there was one bar there right in the edge of town called the Down Under. And it was because it was in the basement. And I swear every drug dealer and drug grower from 100 miles around would come to that bar on a weekend, either Friday or Saturday night. So needless to say, that's where we went to. And then there's the only mixed drinks bar in town at that time, south of town, called Cheyenne Lilies. And there was a guy that owned it that was actually a target for the FBI. And we didn't know if we'd ever get in on that. But the first thing we did was go down in the county below there with this informant. And we made a case on a lady by the name of Ma Greer. They call her Ma Greer. She was a huge marijuana dealer. And that was our very first case. Everybody was floored that we, quote, got Ma Greer. But we just continued to work that area. And we were fortunate enough that the local investigator, the state investigator, he turned 4 or 5 informants while we conducted that undercover investigation. And one of them was a top tier. He was a top tier informant. We learned a lot from him, and he also turned some really good cases for us. But we ended up making about 120 cases on about 80, 75 or 80 individuals, I forget now, in a 9 county wide area over that period. And Terry told me, he said, this will be your best investigation because I had no court. You know, every once in a while, Terry would disappear for 2 or 3 days, and have court back over in Southwest Missouri on some of his previous case from the previous year. So that was my break-in period. And uh, to give your audience an idea of what it was like to be an undercover in the patrol at that time, no one knew you were there. Just the troop captain, the two investigators. My wife didn't even know where I was going each week. I would leave. We kind of had a schedule. It worked out over time. You wanted to be in the bars on Friday and Saturday night. So you would go home on Sundays. And sometimes you'd leave the bar on Saturday after it closed and drive home and get home Sunday morning, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But you'd be home Sunday and Monday, take off Sunday and Monday. And then on Tuesday, you would drive back to Jefferson City, which is 200 miles for us. Um, for me and Terry, Terry lived in Cape Girardeau. I lived in the adjoining town, Jackson. And you would get there about 3 o'clock, because you didn't want to spend too much time with the staff around, but you had
Right.
to turn your drugs in from the week before to the lab, and you had to check out money from the lieutenant for the coming week. So you had to get there before 5 to make those two things happen. And then we would sit around and write reports and turn our reports into about 8 o'clock. And then we would go to this bar called Johnny's Back Door every freaking Tuesday night. They played oldies on Tuesday night. And that's where all the narcs would show up there. You know, there's like 8 of us for the whole freaking state. And we would that was where we could kind of let down our hair and talk about our week before, and have a good time. And then we
Yeah.
would go to breakfast right down the road, usually the Mark Twain restaurant, and we would roll into a bed at some local hotel at 2 o'clock in the morning. And then the next day on Wednesday, you would get out of there by noon or 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock and drive to your respective investigations, which again, ours was in West Plains. So, and then you would start your week on a Wednesday usually. And your backup was literally 100 miles away. You had no backup. There was no surveillance team. You just had to make sure that you called in on the 800 line before the next morning, before 7 a.m. they start checking. If you weren't on that recorder, it was a big deal. And if you hadn't called in by 9 o'clock, they were calling out the troops looking for you.
Yeah.
So you would call in and say, I did this today and made this buy, or I didn't have any luck at all, and I'm in at this apartment. We have different apartments around the state, and I'll call in the office tomorrow at noon. We had a phone that Terry came up with this idea, but we had this phone. And at that time, you know how phones were. I mean, there was no cell phones, no pagers, no anything. So we had a phone with a 50-foot cord, and you plug it in the kitchen, and you drag it all the way to beside your bed, and you put it right beside your bed. And then you had instructions, the girls at the office, don't call me before noon. And then when they would call you, because they always needed something for a report or something, and or maybe the sergeant wanted to talk to you, but that phone would ring and you could just pick it up and be in the floor beside your bed. It worked great, but that was the routine, and then you would get up noon, 1 o'clock, write reports. Everything that was the real you, was in a briefcase, a locked briefcase. All your drugs was in there, your extra money, and everything that was the undercover you was outside that briefcase. So the
Yeah.
briefcase was was the patrol, and everything outside that briefcase was non-patrol. So we would start over again, and about 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon, we'd go down to Pizza Hut and carb up because we knew we were going to go to the bar,
Yeah.
and we do it all over again. So that was your typical. Sometimes we work a buy-in. We might have a buy-in early, late afternoon or something like that. Um, but those buys they'd never happen in the morning. Absolutely never happened in the morning. They were always in the afternoon or the evening. And then you would have them just pop up. I can remember I was working that bar one night, and there was a guy there. We knew he was a target. He was a grower. We'd done a little bit of research, and I'd been going to the bar long enough, shooting enough pool. I've been there for half a year. One evening, I just asked him for an ounce, and not a big buy at all. And he said, sure. He said, I don't remember if I jumped in the car with him or followed him. I just don't remember, but we went to a house there in West Plains and we walk into this house and it's like the first test. It was literally a test. And there's these like four or five guys sitting around this living room and they're watching a pornography on this, VHS tape, or VCR tape or whatever. It's pornography and they're drinking beer and there's one naked light on in the middle of the living room. And they pitched me a bag and had me roll a joint, which, again, that's part of your training. You learn how to roll
Sure.
joints and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But I realized immediately, I thought, oh, this is the big test,
Yeah.
So, roll a joint and we didn't inhale, I hate to say this, but we didn't inhale them, but we would simulate because
Sure.
marijuana is hard to smoke. You got to get it down the lower part of your lungs. And there is a way that you can look like you partake when you don't, especially when it's dark. Now, it's hard to do in a room like that. But I
Right.
must have passed the test because we walked outside and I bought an ounce of dope off this guy. And I knew he was a good hit because on raid, after the raid, he contracted with a law firm out of St. Louis, uh, which was a law firm that any heavy hitter, that's the one they use. And I think we had four individuals in that investigation that used this particular law firm out of St. Louis. And he was one of them. That was the only thing we did was a 1 ounce buy.
Wow.
Never got a second buy-in on him or anything. It was just a happenstance. I just, we're just sitting there shooting some pool. I
Yeah.
asked him offhand, make an ounce buy. He probably got probation for it. I don't even know. But
Yeah.
anyway, it's kind of an interesting story.
Yeah. And I gotta wonder, listening to you talk here about how it was in that time frame where, not a lot of management oversight and involvement. I gotta wonder, maybe that's why you guys were so successful. I see today, you and I were talking offline this morning, and during my career, I did a lot of undercover as well, and I saw management getting involved and operational plans that had to be prepared and surveillance teams that had to participate, and there was so much red tape oftentimes that I gotta wonder. I mean, those are positive things for the most part. I gotta wonder if back in that time frame, that's why you guys were so successful. You didn't have to deal with all of that. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I continue to go back to this initial vetting with these state organizations, whether again it be the state police or state highway patrol. That initial vetting process, that initial probationary period, 3 or 4, 5 years on the road. Um, what this and this happened with the patrol occasionally. You would have a little, you'd have some oversight. You're wondering where that's coming from. Why are they um, uh, looking at us that closely? And they forget that they put a road trooper out there and they expect him to operate on his own, and he's good at it. He does it. Well, the same thing happens with the narcs. They're set up to operate on their own. We had a staff, and this actually comes from the Bob Ashurst model, is leave them alone and let them go the way they need to go. Same thing with Mark James. Mark James is a good example. We moved those chess pieces on the board. We got so tight with the communities that we worked in that we could, and these are his words. We moved the chess pieces on the board. You got so good, and I sound like I'm bragging, but I'm not. But let's say you did an investigation in the West Plains area, and then you do one up in the northeast part of the state, and then you're dipping across state lines. If I worked in the northeast part of the state, I ended up in Quincy, Illinois half the time. So now you're dealing with a guy from another state. And then you do an investigation where a guy flies in from California and he's selling you cocaine. He's from California. You get to know more about the drugs and the language than the guy locally you're dealing with. You know more than he does because he's never been out of West Plains, Missouri, never been out of Howell County. So you actually know more, and they can feel that. They can feel your knowledge base. Now they think it came from because you're a bad guy, but it actually came from the breadth and the depth of the investigations you've done over time. So,
Yeah.
so the staff, they let that happen. They really couldn't supervise us. Um, my captain told me one time, and I had a lot of respect for my first captain. Like I said, he's a little bit scary. I can remember Joe Crumper sitting in the captain's office one day, and he says to Captain Duckworth, he said, "Captain, you've got ice water for blood in your veins." I mean, he was a
Wow.
cold son of a bitch. He just
Yeah.
was. But he
Yeah.
told me one time, I was a farmer from Southeast Missouri, and he told me, Alan, he said, I picked the straightest arrows because he said this job's going to warp you a little bit. And that was I never forgot that, obviously, because I just shared it with you.
Yeah.
But they looked for people that because you're operating in an environment that people think you're a criminal. But at the same time, and this again, this came from the legends before me, but the rule was, and it was a solid rule, don't do anything in your investigation you don't want to testify to on the stand. Because you're going to testify to everything that happens in that investigation, it's going to come out on the stand. They will assign an investigator to you and look at your background. So, um, so that again, that's a hard line to walk, a very hard line to
Yeah.
walk. And then you got somebody like Terry Mills saying, you've got to look a little rougher and you got to be a little crazier than the people that you're dealing with. So um, at that level that we worked, and looking back, very few organizations worked like that. There's very few organizations that worked at that level, that integrated themselves the um, into the community. John Bickers worked at Taco Tico in Jefferson City. I said, "What'd you do with your money?" I said, "I never took up I was a photographer, independent photographer in West Plains." He actually would work at a business. I said, "What'd you do with your money?" "Well, you can't. There's no way that you can take that money." So he said,
Right.
"What I had to do was I made a copy of it, and then I would cash a check, and he would turn the money over to the state, and it was put back in the general revenue fund." But he had to
Wow.
keep a track of the money that he
Yeah.
made. He worked at a place in Kansas City for a couple of months to get in with this particular group, and he would make a copy of it, turn it in with his reports, cash a check, and it was turned over to the General Revenue Fund.
Wow.
Crazy.
And just so listeners caught that, you're saying that undercover troopers in their undercover capacity were working legitimate jobs getting paid
Yes,
sometimes. Yeah. That's
sometimes.
amazing.
Yeah,
That's dedication.
yeah, yeah.
That's
You
incredible.
had to find, ideally, you would find something like when I worked the long term in the Northeast Missouri, the microwave towers were just starting to go up, but I never ran into anybody that put one up. Well, I had an informant for a while that had helped on a crew put one up, so he knew some of the language and stuff. So what do I do for a living? I do I do the site
Like site
surveys, and
surveys.
yeah, and I even carried a sheet of employment forms if somebody wanted to work for me. So I'd make a buy off some guy, and he'd be looking for a job. I said, "Well, here, fill this out," and he'd give me all this information, date of birth, and where he lived. So I'd file that with my report. But yeah,
That's
back to your
genius.
original question, uh, they 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 knew we were motivated to to make those criminal investigations successful. And so they basically left us alone. The only time we really got counsel, they would figure out, because you could tell by our gas receipts where we were at, and actually where we called in the night before, but we would gang up. Sometimes we gang up I can remember we gang up in Rolla, Missouri, because it's kind of central, and we come in, have a zone meeting, supervisors meeting, and the sergeant would say, "You guys got to quit ganging up." But then he would never do anything when we did gang
Yeah.
up. So we just kind of ignored it.
Yeah. Well, you talked about, your kind of your first indoctrination and your first case there. You had also, I mean, you've worked so many undercover cases, but you mentioned again offline our conversation, buying $100,000 of meth from, I think it was from the Pharaohs motorcycle gang or motorcycle club. Does that sound correct?
Yeah, now we're going to jump forward. If we go to that, I don't care to do
Well, no,
that at
no, no.
all.
Let's stay. Let's keep going down the
Okay.
path we're on right now.
Okay. Yeah.
This episode of the Right to Remain Silent True Crime Podcast is sponsored by Graphic Options. When it comes to custom screen printing, embroidery, and promotional gear, Brenda and her team are the real deal. I trust them with everything, whether it's a hat for my consulting business, a shirt for my podcast, or a large order of both. They've never let me down. They don't treat you like just another order. They listen, they care, and they make sure you walk away with something you're proud to put your name on. You have the right to great service and quality, and that's exactly what you'll get at Graphic Options. Visit graphicoptionsonline.com. That's graphicoptionsonline.com and let them know the Right to Remain Silent podcast sent you. Yeah, let's bring what's the next thing you want to talk about
Well,
case wise here?
I guess in this time period that we're talking about now,
Mm-hmm.
uh, my second long-term investigation was in Macon, Missouri, and Terry Mills and I went up there and set that up in February. I can remember it was so cold, and there one of the conclusions I came to by the end of that investigation is all the criminals in the state of Missouri are south of the Missouri River. It was a hard investigation. There's just not a lot of criminals in northern Missouri. There are nice German people, and they don't. But anyway, and I had one informant. He was very weak. And but we figured out that if I lived in Macon, that I could work Kirksville, Moberly, and Hannibal. They're all about 50, 55 miles from Macon. And I found out there was no drugs in Hannibal. I'd end up across the river at Quincy. Kirksville, just a good farm town. There was a couple of bars up there that guys hung out. I didn't do any good in there up there. I finally hauled a couple of informants in to help me kind of break that investigation loose. But where I did finally make it a success, I guess, is in Macon. I was running one bar, um, and there was a lady that worked there. I would show up every Wednesday night and I would shoot pool. And I always took someone with me. I'd take another undercover with me, or I had an informant with me. I always brought somebody with me. And I'd spend the whole evening there, shoot pool, drink beer. And the hardest thing was dodging the women, because you show up in a pretty nice car and you
Right.
got a pocket full of money, you got all your teeth, and
Right.
that was the hardest part. Was it got so bad that I finally told Terry, I said, I'm going to have to do something. I said, he said, well, is there anyone? This is kind of how you dodge those kind of situations. He says, is there anyone there that you could hook up with and go on a date with? And I said, yeah, there's a gal that lives in the apartment where I'm at, and I said she's making eyes and stuff. And he said, we'll set up a date with her. He said, I'll come up there. And he said, we'll go out and we'll get drunk and everybody will think she's your girlfriend and that'll be the end of it. She actually worked at the local McDonald's. But anyway, that's exactly what we did. I mean, he shows up one evening. I asked her if she wanted to go down and get a few drinks. We got just blasted. Found out later her father was a reserve deputy. So
Oh
one of the
wow.
things we told her, yeah, after the investigations, don't hang out with people like us. I
Right.
mean, but anyway, I never did go out with her again. But the point is that there was actually some whores that was working this bar. They left me alone after that because they thought I had a girlfriend. So it
Yeah.
worked.
Yeah.
So you've got to figure those kind of things out too. But anyway, one night the barmaid came to me. I've been going in there for 6 months. And she shows me some marijuana, uses some amount of marijuana, says, you want some of this? I said, I don't smoke marijuana. Kind of laughed at her. And so a little bit later, she comes by and she's got some LSD. And I said, and I don't freaking use LSD. And then
Mm-hmm.
as I left that night, I leaned over and I told her, I said, I'd tell you what I would do, though. I'd take 200 dosage units of that LSD if you could
Yeah.
set that up. And that Friday night, I bought 200 hits of LSD. And then I ended up doing the cocaine dealer in town from off of her, and I ended up doing the primary marijuana dealer, and so it got me in the loop. But it took a half a year, and I didn't use an informant. I didn't use an informant to make that case. There was a couple of bikers up there. This kind of give you an idea of when you're not going to be successful using undercover as a tool to make cases. in fact, this LSD came from the bikers, but I ended up doing one of their wife. It was the wife. She was a nurse. And I felt
Oh,
bad about it. I
wow.
mean, but she sold it, but they fronted out their wife. We never got close to these two bikers. They were brothers because they just don't deal with someone that they weren't raised from the cradle with. You know, if you're
Right.
not local, they're not going to deal. And bikers are probably the hardest to infiltrate because again, they have a certain code, certain set of rules that they operate by, and they're pretty smart for the most part. Some are dumb, but
Hmm.
for the most part, they're pretty smart. I mean, you know that you've worked it.
Right.
And but there's certain people that you will never make an undercover case. There's, an interesting thing. It's kind of a side note, but I'd worked undercover for a solid year before I went to the DEA basic undercover school
Oh, wow.
in Kansas City. 1 year, and it was so enlightening to see there was different ways you could make a case on a drug dealer. You could use conspiracy, you could use financial investigations, you could do diversion investigations. I'm going, wow, there's all that you can do. Surveillance. I had no
Yeah.
idea. The only way you can make a case was working undercover.
Yeah.
And so it really, not that I used those tools at that time, but it really opened up a whole new vista for me because I didn't know. I thought undercover was it, and because
Right.
that's what the patrol, and that's actually a weakness too for the patrol at that time, was that's all they used was undercover. Now again, they were very good at it, but and some people you're not going to do them any other way than in
Correct.
an undercover role. So it's kind of a side note, but
Yeah. Yeah. y- y- let me ask this. Back in that time frame, what were you've mentioned LSD and marijuana. What were the primary illicit drugs that you guys were encountering? Was there, one or two most popular, or was it, just a variety?
no, we're in rural Missouri. We didn't work in St. Louis or Kansas City per se. We didn't work in St. Louis at all, unless it was auto theft. Um, so a lot of marijuana, and marijuana was illegal. And we didn't even work marijuana in cases in Columbia, Boone County because such a liberal, so it was the most liberal county, probably still is in Missouri. So they wouldn't prosecute the cases. There was quite a bit of methamphetamine, more cocaine than anything else. But if you got in the real rural areas, the people really couldn't afford cocaine. It was kind of interesting because in South Central Missouri, when I worked it, they would get a gram of cocaine, and they would at a party they would smoke the marijuana, and then at the night, at the end of the night, the deal was is everybody got a little shot of that cocaine. It was kind of interesting. I did work at Lake of the Ozarks for a short period of time one summer. I called my supervisor and I said, before I get out of here, I wanted to go to Lake of the Ozarks. I think that would be fun and do an undercover investigation. So at one time I had undercover apartments in Macon. We had one in Columbia that we all used, and then I had one down in Camden at Lake the Ozarks, and it was all cocaine. I had an informant. He wasn't a great informant, but he wasn't a real bad informant. And all we bought was cocaine, and there was quite a bit of cocaine on the strip at that time.
Hmm.
Part of it was according to the area. Methamphetamine really hadn't come on the scene yet. It's poor man's cocaine, and people hadn't figured out. It was being made in large batches at large labs. So the bikers had control of it at that time. So it really hadn't come on hard and fast yet. So sometimes you come across some mushrooms. Today, it's kind of interesting, and I'll just touch on this just for a second, but I can remember buying fentanyl one time, but it was diverted from the system, and it was a couple pills, and it was $60 a pill. So you can
Huh.
see the difference in yesterday and the
Yeah.
way the way the way it is today. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. You said something interesting just a little bit earlier about, spending 6 months in a bar and, developing relationships and building your undercover persona. I think it's important to mention for listeners to know that like it's not like TV and the movies where you ride up on a motorcycle, walk into a bar first night, and you're buying, you're doing multi-kilo purchases with, the Gulf cartel out of Mexico. There is a lot of effort and a lot of time expended and working these types of cases sometimes, correct?
Yeah, yeah. It's you know what you try to do is you take down. Let's say you have your raid day, and before that raid takes place, you'll pick out two or three guys that are girls that you think can continue into the next investigation, or you can use to go on up the ladder. And hopefully you did that during the investigation too. But you're always looking for, you know, I call it the misery factor. You can sit out here and you can make the numbers, but
Hmm.
what you really want to do is focus on, especially if you're working at a state or a federal level, you want to focus on not numbers so much, but who's creating the most misery in your community or in your state, you know, and focus on those individuals because your resources are extremely limited. So, uh, to me, that's that's just being smart.
Right, right. That makes complete sense. So, we're still on your first stint here. Walk us through that. Like, how long did that last? And are there other, standout cases in your mind that you would want to mention
Not necessarily cases. You know, that's where I learned.
or experiences? Yeah, knowledge.
Yeah, that's where I learned. You know, how to negotiate, how to handle paranoia. There's a certain level of paranoia. You can use that as a currency. The other person's going to be paranoid too. It's where I learned how to negotiate. You know, you negotiate as much for your safety and how you're going to position the person as you do to buy the drug. I made a lot of mistakes that could have. I remember one time I'm using this informant out of Lake of the Ozarks, and he was a previous vet of the Vietnam War, and he had a whole side blowed out of his leg.
Mm,
But anyway, he'd spent some time in the Veterans Hospital in Columbia, and he made a contact up there. This guy was a cocaine user, and so he makes a contact with a source that worked at the Veterans Hospital. So one day he says, "Well, let's go up to Columbia. We're not doing any good here, and see if we can make a deal." So, and I have a water patrol woman, female, with me as a backup. Great, you know, team there. And then I've got this informant, and he's pretty solid too. I mean, I could have counted on him to back me
yeah.
up to a certain extent. So we go to this bar in Columbia. We meet this guy, and this guy he says, "Come on out to the car." And I think we're going to go out to the car, and I'm going to buy some cocaine. And I've got $1,000 on me, and they know I've got $1,000 on me. That's what we were set up for. We get in the car. There's another guy there, and they take off. And I'm going, oh, they peeled me right away from my backup, just right away. And of
Oh,
course, we go
yeah.
right down to the bottoms of Columbia there, and right where, in fact, Joe Crump, the year before, he had an informant who was laid down on the pavement, shotgun stuck to his head, and they ripped him off. So here I am in the same area, you know. I mean, you learn from those kind of experiences. We go in this apartment. Now there's a third guy in there, so there's three of them and one of me. I did have a gun on me that day. I didn't always carry a gun, but I had a gun on me that day, which wouldn't have done much good in that set of circumstances. And they couldn't get the cocaine, couldn't find the cocaine. Again, you got to keep in the back of your mind, these guys know I've got $1,000 on me
Right.
somewhere. And you split that money up. You know, you put part of it in your right sock, part in your left sock, part of it in your money clip, you know. So if you get ripped, they don't get all of it, right?
Right.
And so anyway, I finally settled for a quarter pound of marijuana. So they run to get a quarter pound of marijuana, $250. They bring it in, and it's just crap. It's just total crap. It's worth maybe $100. So I start negotiating, and I can see this guy as he puts it down, his hand's shaking a little bit. I thought, I've got him, because his
Hmm.
hand's shaking. And so I said, I'm not paying $250 for that. And then he looks around, he looks right at me, said, no, $250. And then I look around and says, okay, $250. And because they had me outnumbered, and they let
Right.
me out, you know, but
Right.
they were probably, you know, I don't know, they were half sure I was a cop, you know, but
Yeah.
but it's kind of like, to me, those kind of situations, it's kind of like not wearing your seatbelt. You know, I probably won't have an accident today, so I won't put my seatbelt on. This guy's probably not a cop, so I'm gonna go ahead and sell to him. If he is a cop, I'll take the hit. You know, I mean, it's just the
Yeah.
way they think. But you can use, the point here is you can use that to your advantage. I had them psychologically, or else they'd laid me down on the floor and they'd have took my $1,000 off my body. But they just didn't have enough nerve to do that. They didn't know if there's a backup team outside or not, But
Right.
anyway, and,
Right.
and, and they got away because I couldn't ID them. I mean, it was a bad case. I should have handled it differently. So the point is that I'm making is that I learned from that stint. To negotiate when I negotiate, negotiate for my safety. I used to teach this, and you've been in my classes, but there's three legs to good negotiation. There's power, information, and time. And you can use those to your advantage. You can have the power is you've got the money. The information is hopefully I know more about you than you know about me. And time is we're going to do this when and where I want to do it, or we're just not going to do it at all. So you can use those to your advantage. You can use paranoia. It's a currency. If you're too paranoid, you're not going to be ineffective. And I've seen undercovers like that they were just always paranoid. They're not going to be effective. You have to
Yeah.
learn to use that to your advantage. I'm not saying don't be paranoid, but I'm just saying use that to your advantage.
Yeah. Great points. Great points. And you made me think of this question here, explaining that scenario. Is there any one or two specific incidents or events in your career that stands out in your mind that were kind of hair raising for you that you're like, oh, this is dangerous. This is,
Mhm.
what have I gotten myself into?
Yeah, well, I shared two with you that obviously stood out in my mind. That one is one that was
Yeah.
probably one of the worst. The other one, I had one in West Plains that was, and I backed out of that one. Uh, but I had bought from these guys before. I had bought from this guy before. I was just trying to get my second buy in, or maybe it might even been a third buy. But there was word around town that there were narcs in town. That happens toward the end of a long-term investigation, and word
Yeah.
gets out. And so I go to this house to make this buy, and as soon as I walked in, the wife wasn't home. There was no kids, and I could actually I am not exaggerating. It felt like there was icicles coming off the ceiling.
Mm.
And so I thought, well, I'm going to go ahead and stand in this door and I'm going to make this buy. And so I stood with my back to the door, and it was the eeriest feeling literally that I've ever felt. I made the buy and went down fine. I left. Everything went fine. Later, I found out on raid day that his brother was in the adjoining room in a bedroom with a shotgun.
Oh,
So I don't know if
yeah.
they thought I was going to rip them or if I was going to try to arrest them, but yeah, I had to have another. Here's a funny story. So I was toward the end of my that first stint in undercover, and what happens is you try to set things up in such a way that you get closer and closer to your home because you're going to have court 6 months from now, and
Hmm.
you're going to be in uniform. You're going to be driving a marked car, and you don't be driving from Cape Girardeau to Macon, Missouri, if you can keep from it. Because every time you turn around, you're going to come across something on the highway, and you're going to have to stop. It's be an accident or whatever.
Right.
So and I've done that. It gets pretty. It takes a long time to get home sometimes.
Yeah.
So what you do is you start operating closer and closer to home. So what I'd done toward the end of my first stint was I'd ask the investigator in Poplar Bluff to turn me an informant, and he did. So when I would come back through Poplar Bluff, I'd call this guy. He was a pretty good informant, and I'd say, "You got anything set up?" And so we did that one Saturday afternoon, and sure enough, he's got a deal set up, and we set up a recorder, and I listened to it because he doesn't know it, but I'm in my hometown. I'm right there, in my
Hmm.
hometown. And I listened to it. I don't recognize the guy's voice. I'm thinking we're doing okay. It's for a quarter pound of marijuana. And so anyway, we jump in the car. We drive out to the Butler-Duncan County line, right down in the Boot Hill near Cullin, Missouri, a little bitty town, but where my first wife was from. I mean, that's how intimate I was with the area.
Wow.
And as we go down a gravel road, we pull into the driveway. There's a big overgrown Buick in the yard with an Arkansas plate on it. And I tell the informant, help me remember that plate number, so I can ID this guy. We walk up to the front door, knock on the door. The guy that answers, I know his first, second, and last name. I went to school with
Oh,
him for 3 years.
Oh,
My
wow.
heart went right up in my throat immediately.
Yeah,
And so, and this all happens just in seconds. I realize he does not recognize me. Of course, I'm growed out, and I think, well, I guess I'll go ahead and do the deal. So I
let's give
go
it a
in.
shot.
Yeah, I sit down, goes right down the road like a regular deal. We talked for a few minutes. He said, "Well, it's right there by your left," and the drugs were right here by my left hand. And I pick them up, look at it. It's really good marijuana. And I remember then somebody knocks on the door and comes in, and I'm thinking, let me turn this off for just a second.
Sure.
And I'm thinking somebody's going to walk in. Somebody else going to walk in. I went to high school, and they're going to recognize me. I've got to get out of here. So I get up and I walk out front, and he walks out front with me on this porch, and he flips on the light because it's dark by now, and it's overhead light comes, and we're literally eye to eye. I think he thought I was going to rip him. And I thought, if he's ever going to recognize me, it's right now. And he just doesn't. I give him his money. We get in the car. We start to leave. This informant thinks he's so big, he's remembering the plate for me. I said, don't worry about it. I know this guy, you know. And then the funny part was I came back later, like 2 or 3 months later, and I'm in uniform, but now I'd actually transitioned back to the road. So I asked for this guy's raid packet, and I end up arresting him. And so, we knock on the door at 6 a.m. in the morning. We can hear them and they're scurrying around. They won't open the screen door on the outside. I finally yelled through. I said, if you don't open the door, I'm going to rip your doors off the hinges. And they find the girl comes out, opens the door, and he's in there. It's the middle of the summer. He's in his underwear, and he's got his marijuana. This guy was a big marijuana dealer, and he's got it in the stove trying to light it, to try to burn it. So I take his arm, I turn around, and he comes around and he tries to hit me, and he's too close. He got a roundhouse that goes on the outside, and I've got this state investigator with me who just loved to fight, and he just pounded him. And so he's sitting there bleeding, sitting on the couch in handcuffs. A few minutes later, still in his underwear. And I asked him, I said, his first name was Roger. I said, Roger, do you remember me? And he looks at me, he looks at my name. He said, oh, yeah, we went to school together. And I said, do you remember me being in here about 3 months ago and I bought some marijuana from you? He says, nah, I don't remember that at all. But anyway, that was pretty wild to walk in and there's one of your high school classmates. And
Yeah,
literally, I mean, I knew his first, middle, last name. It wasn't we were great friends, but we were close acquaintances
yeah,
and
yeah.
farmed in the same community. So that was interesting. But
That had to have been hair raising.
it was. I figured out. I kind of you kind of think ahead, but I thought if he recognized me while I do the deal, I'll just stick a gun in his ear, and he's got a phone. I'll call troop headquarters and have him send a uniform out here, and we'll just haul him in. And
Yeah,
but he didn't. He just didn't recognize me. It's pretty crazy.
yeah. It's amazing how how things happen sometimes.
Hmm.
How long, so you kind of alluded to going back to the road at some point. How long were you doing narcotics for this first time?
Just shy of 3 years. Which is that's a good time period. 2.5, 3 years. There was guys that came before me that spent a lot longer than that undercover, and it's really hard to transition back to the road um, when that happens. It's really hard.
Yeah. And you had mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that you're like, hey, I'll dip my toe in the water here and try this narcotics thing and I'll eventually go back to the road and be a better trooper. After your time doing, working narcotics here, you end that, you do go back to the road. What are your thoughts at that point in your career? Are you thinking, man, I want to get back into narcotics investigations, or how does it unfold for you?
No, I felt good coming back to the road. I was a better trooper. I can remember one of my lieutenants at the troop level, Vernon Hopkins, Lieutenant Vernon Hopkins. He said, "I've never seen that happen before. An narc come back to the road and just transition right back in and learn the paperwork and get right back to writing tickets and then the other part of it was like you had." Some kind of intuition. You had some intuition. You could meet a car and you just automatically knew there were drugs in that car. So you turn around and you try to, find some reason to stop the car. but my drug arrest went up dramatically. But just
Hmm.
because there's a whole culture out here. A lot of people don't realize this, but about the time most people go to bed, kind of going off on a tangent here, but there's a whole culture that comes alive. And I didn't know it existed even after 4 or 5 years of working the road. But it's just a different lifestyle that they don't work. Um, they run the bars. They go to dinner with them down at the local truck stop afterwards. You walk out to the parking lot, have them fix a flat. I mean, they live a different life, and the drug culture is ensconced in that environment, and you don't realize that. Well, when you work in the road, you can spot that. You can see
Yeah.
that lifestyle, uh, and it was interesting to know that, and I guess not know it in my first 5 years working the road, that whole culture existed over here to the side that I'd never seen, even though I worked nights.
Yeah.
I would come across the edges of it, but really didn't understand how big it was or how solid it was.
Huh. So you transition back from narcotics to the road. How long do you stay working the road, and then what happens from there?
I guess I was on the road about a year, maybe. And one of the things that had happened during the end of my tenure in Undercover, Terry Mills and I got together and wrote up a memo that went over to research and development saying, pointing out that we're losing a lot of expertise. We bring these guys off the road, put them in undercover. They gain all this knowledge in narcotics and drug investigation, and then we send them right back to the road, and we don't do anything with that. And we probably need long-term investigators. Well, I didn't think it would change, but what happened not too long after I was, like I said, about a year, they opened up for, they called it overt positions. And, we had to go to a dictionary and look up and see what overt meant, but basically it meant you couldn't have long hair and a beard. But in any case, they opened that up, and I applied for it with two or three other guys here in the troop. But I was the only one that had any narcotics experience. I mean, no one else was even really viable. So I took that position as the Troop B investigator, narcotics investigator for the, I don't know, 13 or 14 counties that exist here. Yeah.
Was that a new, so maybe you said it, was that a new position to the patrol, or was that something that had existed and you see what I'm saying? Like, was that a new position that you applied for, or were there overt narcotics investigators prior to that?
No, we were the first ones.
Okay.
Yeah, there was I want to say they sent about 10 guys through a school, but the undercovers were in there too. I want to say there were only five of us. There was John Vickers over in Southwest Missouri, Tom Gray in the Kansas City area, Terry Mills in South Central or Central, and then Joe Crump in the Troop C area, and then me down here in Southeast Missouri. I don't know who had South Central Troop G, but anyway, there was only about,
Mhm.
I want to say five of us. It was overwhelming. It was absolutely overwhelming because there was not another full-time narcotics investigator in Southeast Missouri. I was it. And there was
Wow.
two DE agents, and one of them was a supervising agent, Herman Hogue. I think you mentioned him
Yeah.
earlier.
Yeah.
He was he was working in Southern Illinois. He had Herman had 20 something counties in Missouri and 20 something in Illinois. He never worked in Missouri unless something fell in his lap. But they had a multi enforcement group in Carbondale, and they had a state task force in Mount Vernon. So they had a lot of presence over there, and so that's where he would work. He would overwrite their cases if they met the federal guidelines, and he didn't work in Missouri at all. So and the locals, they didn't have anyone assigned to narcotics full time. So I was it. So what happened was I would get these freaking phone calls, and I wouldn't get one or two. I'd get 10 or 12 a day. to the point that finally I called John Vickers, who had Southwest Missouri, and we asked for a audience with the colonel. And that time it was Ford, and we went in and told him we're overwhelmed. We can't. The way we've set this up is we can't respond, and we didn't get much response out of that. That particular colonel didn't help us very much. But we came back, and I mean, you just did what you could do. And so what I finally decided to do, I would just make a circle every day. I would start here in South in Cape, and I might drive over to Fredericktown and meet with a trooper who had some drug information, and I go down to Poplar Bluff, meet someone there, maybe drive across to Dexter, meet an informant, potential informant, and then drive to Sykeston and meet with assistant chief there, and then drive back on up to Cape. I usually went over to the DEA office and the ATF office. They both had really good supervisors in both those offices at that time, and have coffee there but I did that every day. And then I made cases on my own. Sometimes I would just jump in and it would just fit, that I'll share one case with you. This is one case I made. I actually got a award from DEA from this case. And this is just how a happenstance occurs. But there was a lieutenant with the Dexter Police Department. His name was Steve Comfort. And he always had a little drug information. And so one day he calls me, he said, "Hey, Al, I got a guy that you need to talk to, make a good informant, I think." So I drop by there and I walk in, and he's got the bad guy with him in the house when I walk in. So we play off. I mean, he was good. We play off like we've known each other. He's a Vietnam vet in a wheelchair. And we just played off like we've known each other forever. And this lady, as a female, uh, she just, goes along with it. She said, "Well, are you ready?" And I said, "Yeah, I guess." And we go out and we get in her truck, and she's got a Ford truck. And every time that she'd shut this truck off, I'd have to get out. It's an old Ford truck and have to jiggle the wires to get it to start again. I spent all afternoon with her. We drove to Fisk, Missouri. We pick up her kid. We drive to Poplar Bluff, Missouri. We drop the kid off, and we pull into a house that I have served a search warrant on just a few days before. So I stay in the truck, pull my cap down over my eyes, so hopefully nobody inside sees me.
Right.
Then we drive to another little town in the Boot Hill, Malden. We go in a bar, and I have to flash my money. So I flash my freaking money. So then we get back in our truck. We drive to another little town, Holcomb, and I end up buying an ounce of cocaine. So we sent it up to the lab, and it was like 98% pure. It was pure cocaine. So,
Mm-hmm.
DEA gets totally excited. So I hooked this girl up again for a little bit bigger buy over in Poplar Bluff. And the general investigator, I'm giving you the long-winded version here, I apologize,
No, go
but he
ahead.
wants to get involved, and she makes him. She knows him, and she sees him in the surveillance. So she takes this money. I'd give her half the money, I think, which you're never supposed to front the money, right? But she
Right.
throws it out the window. And so there's dollar bills all over the roadside. We end up stopping her, and she'd made the mistake that morning, I think, I mean, you kind of had to feel sorry for her because she was constantly dealing with her mother and her kids, but she put her mother in her car during this deal. Might have been the previous deal, which makes her an accessory, her mom. So we used that as leverage. Put her up in a
Mm-hmm.
hotel that night, asked her to do the right thing. She could have left that night. We would have known the difference anyway. The next day, she's still there. She said, "I'll help you make this guy." So we go down to Holcomb that day, and we bust this guy for like an ounce of cocaine. And we go to his house, and we end up finding a pound of pure cocaine at his house. That's
Oh,
before
wow.
dogs. It was pretty
Yeah.
pretty crazy how we found this. It was outside in a garbage can that was full of corn that he fed his birds with, or squirrels or something. But I can't believe we found it. But anyway, and it was 98% pure. So we tried to roll him, and we didn't know it at the time. But she was the sister, I think, to the former outlaw motorcycle gang member. So she had connections to the bikers, which is
Mm-hmm.
obviously where this cocaine had come from.
Yeah.
And so anyway, just that's a case I made. I mean, that's crazy. I just go into this guy's house
Yeah.
to interview him as an informant, and by the end of the night, literally took me 4 hours to buy an ounce of cocaine, and before the investigation's over, we end up, 2 weeks later, having a pound of pure cocaine on the table, which is if you cut that, I don't know what that's worth, but that's a lot of money.
Oh yeah,
Um,
and that's a
so
great
that was a pretty good case that just come out of left
yeah.
field.
Yeah, that's a great example, Alan, of you never know what's going to happen in the narcotics world.
Uh,
All right, well, walk us through. Keep going here, and tell us about the covert aspect and how it continued to unfold for you. I mean, the overt aspect of it.
yeah, really what happened, I discovered over that year, and it was just right at a year that most of the problem in Southeast Missouri was methamphetamine. And you could go to any little town down in the Boot Hill, Lilburn or Risco. I mean, just little bitty towns, and there was people walking around with a freaking needle sticking out of their arm. Everybody was addicted to meth in every little town, and it was being supplied by someone in the Poplar Bluff area. We really didn't know who. There was the president of the Pharaohs at that time. His name was Jerry Duncan, and but there was about 7 or 8 members, and they were strategically scattered around in Southeast Missouri. There was one here in Jackson, there was one down in Malden, there was one over in Wayne County, a couple in Poplar Bluff, one down near Risco, Ronnie Peacock, and those were like little Walmarts. So it was like a distribution center in these little Walmarts spreading
Hmm.
out this methamphetamine all over Southeast Missouri. So that was really the problem was the Pharaohs and this methamphetamine that no one had put a finger on. ATF knew this was going on. They knew the players. They identified all the Pharaohs members. They knew every gun they had, but they really didn't know what to do about this meth problem. They didn't. They just kind of sit on it and didn't know how to move forward on that investigation. No one had taken the tiger by the tail, so to say.
Right, right. Huh. So how did that unfold?
Well, if we go to that, we need to jump to the task force.
Well, let's talk about the drug task force and your position as an overt investigator. Tell us about how that came into existence.
Uh, Really, how that came about was there was so much methamphetamine use in the state of Missouri by that time. It was actually number one in the nation some years. Senator Kit Bond was able to peel out money and get money allotted to come to Missouri. They came to Missouri was designated for the state of Missouri for the enforcement of to handle the meth problem. Basically, it went straight to the Missouri Department of Public Safety to handle. And so, what happened here in Southeast Missouri? The chief of police of Sykeston, his name was Mike Phelan, and the chief of police of Poplar Bluff, Dennis Long, they got their heads together and they wrote a grant asking for money. I think it was like $350,000. They were going to cover the whole 8th congressional district, which goes all the way up to Raleigh, a large area. Um, Assign a director to handle it. And anyway, they made up this whole grant request and sent it up to DPS. DPS sent it right back, said too big, too complicated. You don't know what you're doing. You don't have expertise in this area. So, go back to the planning board. So they got in their cars. They drove straight to Jeff City. They met with the colonel. At that time, it was Mel Fisher, very progressive colonel, kind of a trooper.
Hmm.
And he said, "Yeah, we'll help you with that. We'll take that on." And the patrol is like a lot of state organizations, a little bit arrogant. They kind of like to operate by themselves. They don't operate with the locals. Well, Fisher wasn't like that. He said, "No." He said, "We'll work with the locals on this." So it filters down to my captain at the time, and so it filtered down to me because it's here in Southeast Missouri. So the next thing I know, I'm calling the cap's office and he's saying, "By the way, you're going to run a task force in Southeast Missouri." And I was really a little resistant. And I always operated on my own by myself
Hmm.
versus a road trooper and then as a narcotics investigator. And I didn't really see the the advantage at that point in the game. But they said we're going to give you two troopers, and each of the larger municipalities here in Southeast Missouri is going to give you one person. So you'll have, including yourself, six people. And I think the grant was something over $100,000. Not really a lot of money to run on, but with the patrols buy money, we would use the patrols buy money. Not bad,
Okay.
you know.
Yeah.
And each PD, they pay for the salary of that officer, so it didn't really cost a lot to run it. And I got good officers. I got Kevin Glazier was an excellent road trooper. I got Leanne Higginbotham, very aggressive. I'm not sure why she put in for narcotics. That would be a good question to ask her. But anyway, excellent officers. And then I ended up getting great local officers. I got guys that had 10, 12. Cliff Hodge from Poplar Bluff PD, he had been a former chief of police there. He
Mm.
was chief of
Hmm.
detectives when I picked him up. So I got Mark Majaris from Cape Girardeau and Mark Crocker from Sykes and DPS. Great officers. They didn't know a lot about narcotics. They knew nothing about undercover work, nothing, zero.
Yeah.
But they had a lot more investigative experience than I did.
Hmm.
Kevin was the number one in felony arrest in the troop the year before. So it kind of give you an
Oh,
idea of
wow.
the
Yeah.
quality of people that I was
Right.
picking up. So we started in. We didn't know what we were doing, so I hooked up with Herman Hogue, the DA agent. He took me over to Southern Illinois, and I worked with the task force in Mount Vernon. There was a lieutenant in charge of it, was state lieutenant, and I picked up their multi-jurisdictional agreement and took a look at that. I sent Kevin and Leanne up to St. Louis to look at the task forces in the St. Louis metropolitan area, and they came back and said they got chalkboards on the wall as a numbers thing. I said, well, we're not doing numbers. We've never done numbers in narcotics division or narcotics section. We're not going to start now. But we didn't follow anything we picked up from up there. But I took this multi-jurisdictional agreement, I rewrote it, and I had the rack at the DA office over here help me edit it, and then the local prosecutor was very helpful. And I took it around, I want to say to 18 agencies, chiefs of police and sheriffs here in Southeast Missouri, and they all signed it with the exception of Pembroke County, who was able to draw their own money.
Hmm.
So everybody was on board, and we had the tactical end of it once a month. We would have an administrative meeting. Bill Farrell, the sheriff in Scott County, became the secretary treasurer, and he set some guidelines from the very beginning. He said, we'll have a meeting once a month. We will have minutes taken, and we will be audited by an independent accountant, independent CPA firm once a year. So those were the guidelines, and those were good ones. They really set a standard for what an independent entity would be able to do in the law enforcement environment. So we started in, like I said, my guys knew nothing, so knew nothing about undercover work. We got lucky. I went to one of the local investigators and I looked through his intelligence files that he had accumulated over the last year while I was gone, and I found this individual that I knew was an old meth cook. And he, so I said, "What'd you do with this guy?" And he said, "Well, I interviewed him." I said, "Well, let's go talk to him." He lived like 5 miles from Sykes, and we drove out there and talked to him. And he was an old hat. I mean, he was an old meth cook from way back. He was a tier one informant. That's what he turned out to be.
Hmm.
And he told me, he said, I was down in Texas one time and D agent pulled me over and said, one day you'll work for us. He said, well, I'm telling you what, Alan, today is that day. He said, I'll work for you. And we paid off a bunch of bad checks and started out like that. But he liked working for us. And he actually taught my guys a lot, taught me a little bit, but he taught me a lot about crack cocaine. We knew nothing about crack cocaine.
Oh,
But
yeah.
this guy actually trained my informants. So, I'm sorry, trained my agents. And so what we would do, we'd have a buy set up, and we'd all six go. One guy to do the deal and five guys to do surveillance. We did everything together for almost a year. I mean, we were inseparable. It really built a strong team. So that was good. That's really I began to see the advantage in working with a group rather than working by myself.
Yeah. What time frame, year wise, was that, do you think? Do you remember?
It had to be late 89 and then into 1990. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. All right. So there, the task force is born. There you go. So
Hmm.
where does it go from there? And you know, it kind of we kind of hit the nail a little bit there earlier, talking about an undercover case you worked with the Pharaohs and a large amount of money. Do you want to talk about? Would it be appropriate to discuss that case now at this point? The hundred thousand
Yes, because
dollar searches.
that happened about the same time. So I worked this year by myself and gathered this intelligence that they were the problem. If you wanted to measure a misery factor, they were creating more misery than anyone else. And so about that same time, we had a very good local investigator, Jim Keithley. He later became superintendent of the Missouri State Highway Patrol, but at that time he was sergeant in charge of investigations for Troop E, and he came up with the idea and pushed it to target these pharaohs. And one of the things this colonel wanted, they had just passed a law where the state of Missouri could do a wire intercept. And he wanted to be the first one to use. I mean, in any, Kansas City or St. Louis or any entity within,
Yeah.
it's always been a federal venue in the state of Missouri up
Right.
to that time. So he wanted to be the first one. So Jim took that on. He said, "Well, let's target these pharaohs. Let's put up a wire intercept on them." And he got with a local ATF agent that had all this information on these bikers, Roger Mullen, and they found out that this the president of the Pharaohs, Jerry Duncan, he had a charge over in Illinois that they could use as leverage. So they bring him in, they roll him over, and this was their investigation. So we didn't even have a narc involved in this. This was the general investigation team and ATF working this thing. So they come to us at one point and they say, okay, this is what we want to do. We're going to use Duncan to order up a large amount of methamphetamine. And then we're going to take that and we're going to turn part of it, we're going to gather money from the other pharaohs to and build a conspiracy. And then we're going to take some of that meth and we're going to give it to them. And at the same time, we're going to serve all these search warrants on their houses and we're going to make this big buy. And so I told them, I said, well, it's never going to work. I said, it's way too complicated. You got to make it simple for drug dealers. And this, and the simpler, the better. Well, I was wrong. I mean, what they laid out, we worked it, and it went right down the road that they set this path on. I was wrong.
Wow. Wow.
We put up a wire intercept on the fellow down at Risco, ran it for 30 days. It was for the most part non-productive. We never got the Signal Drug Task Force sat on the side waiting for the right phone call. Like if a deal was going to go down, we'd go out and surveil it. Didn't happen in 30 days. All we did was man this. And they're very labor intensive. You've probably been involved in them before.
Right.
It's 30 days, 24 hours a day, two agents on at a time. It's just so I never wanted to do another one. I never got involved in another one after that. It's just too
Yeah.
much. But anyway, it did give us information on who was a member and who was not, because they would use the term bro to indicate a member. And so it gave us in the conspiracy, you know how important that is. That gave
Right.
us some good information on the conspiracy. So at the same time, we served a search warrant on Jerry Duncan's house, came up with, I want to say 32 or 33 guns, every one of them legal. There wasn't an illegal gun. And then he's wondering, this was just a little more leverage. He just asked the ATF agent, he knew him. He said, "Why are you serving a search warrant on me?" He said, "Well, you're a convicted felon." He said, "No, I'm not." He said, "No." He said, old uh, you've got this old auto theft charge out of Duncan County." He said, "Well, no, I don't." He said, "Yes, you do." But you could just see the ATF agent's face went white. He goes back out to his
Oh,
car, makes a quick call. He goes because Jerry had said, "I got that expunged from my record." He actually used the term expunged,
oh,
and
okay.
but his lawyer didn't do his work. I mean, it was still there, so he was still
Oh,
a felon. So now we really had the hammer on him.
yeah.
So sure enough, we have him get together with his with the other Pharaoh's members to have a meeting. And this is where Jerry, and I kept telling him he's going to screw us because that's just what they do. He turns on this
Yeah.
grinder, something noise in his woodworking shop, and you can't hear the conversation. We've got it wired. You can't hear one word. But he walks out of there with like, I want to say $18,000, 15, 16, 15 or 18. I can't remember now. But he walks out, says, this is the money they gave me to buy the drugs. You don't know. They might have given him $50,000. Who knows?
Right.
But it told us a couple of things. Number one, we had the members identified, and number two, they were the problem. They were we didn't know who the source was beyond Jerry, but we knew Jerry was right in. He was the
He's in it.
conduit.
Yeah.
Yeah. So so then we had him call his source, and this was on I think this was on March the 11th of 1990. I don't know why I remember that. My birthday's in March, maybe. But anyway, we had him call his source. We ran it, DEA ran it. This is kind of interesting too. ATF was in the middle of this investigation, so they wanted to use their undercover, but it's a drug deal. So Herman Hogue, the DA, says, no, here's going to be the undercovers, either Alan Foust or Terry Mills or somebody else they pick. That's going to be the undercovers. He did not want another federal agent to do the undercover.
Yeah.
So anyway, I got to do the undercover work. And we met the source on the Walmart parking lot in Farmington that morning, me and Jerry. And it was kind of a back and forth. He didn't want to do the. I don't remember the whole deal, but finally he said, "Well, give me part of the money up front." So I was able to get away from somehow got away from the deal to kind of talk about it. And there was a surveillance car within talking distance of me, sitting there, two guys that was out of his sight.
Hmm.
We were doing it right out in the middle of the parking lot on a light standard, sitting on a light standard.
Yeah.
And I said, call Nick Broughton he was the guy responsible for the money on the street. I said, tell him I need $15,000, which they had fronted us. So if we'd lost it, we'd have lost their money. I said, I need $15,000 I'm going to front it. And he said, well, give me a few minutes. I said, you've got about 30 seconds. So anyway, he comes back and he put it on his shoulders. I mean, you know how the feds work. You're a
Oh
Fed.
yeah.
You have to call
Yeah.
the cocaine desk or the meth desk or whatever.
Right.
He put it on his shoulders. He said, front it. So I went over there and I said, well, let me get it out. And he said, no, no, it's all right. He said, no, no cop would front the money, I don't think. So
Yeah.
he ends up giving me 10 pounds of meth. And I forget exactly how that went down. We arrested him right there on the lot. He was I remember he was diabetic and he's in the line at Kentucky Fried Chicken because he needed to eat. And they arrested him right there in the line at Kentucky Fried Chicken. But we had seen the drop off. We had a plane up and we seen the drop off to him. And we ended up arresting his source, which was Cecil Summerfield. That was the big deal. Was Cecil was the distributor, and we arrested the guy that he worked with, which was his uncle, I believe, from Bolivar County. Anyway, we got the sources, and so that broke their back. They took that meth in. I let them do it, and they took it down to Wacapello, and they turned over a marked amount. It didn't have to be the whole 10 pounds to the bikers, and they arrested all of them. So, and then
Huh.
they served the search warrants and they seized about 200 guns. I don't think they were able to keep the guns. Most of them were legal. But these guys, it broke their back. I mean, it completely broke their back. Jerry Duncan, he ends up, and I'm sure he is, if he's not dead, he's in the Witness Tech Protection Program. He made out like a bandit because he
Yeah.
was as bad as the rest of them. Cecil rolled over, and me and Jim Keithley actually met him in California to do his source. And
Wow.
we got down there, and they've got at that time, they had an intelligence program. Here we had, I can't remember the name, but out there it was called Western. And you could just plug a guy in,
Hmm.
and it'd pop up if he was in the system, pop up. Well, we plugged this guy's name, and we're working with a task force out there, a state task force. And the Arizona State Police are watching a lab right across the border in Arizona where this guy's cooking. So our job was done. They were going to take him
Yeah.
over anyway. And I told Cecil, I said, now you bring the money out there for the deal because I'm going to do another 10-pound deal out there. I just said it offhand. He shows up with $80,000 in cash. I was just floored. We go to the hotel. I told the guys here, I said, I'm not riding out there with Jerry. I'm going to fly out there. If he makes it out there, fine. I don't care. Well, he shows
Yeah.
up with his wife and he's got $80,000 in cash. So I just
Holy
took it.
smoke.
I didn't know what
Yeah.
else to do. I take it over to the task force, the state task force, And I said, can I lock this up? And they said, what is it? I said, well, it's a little bit of money. I opened it up. And they put us up against me and Keith up against the wall and took a picture of us. And then they wouldn't lock it up. They thought we'd stole the money or whatever. So Jim, he said, well, in California, we got nothing to do now. Always wanted to go to Tijuana. I said, we've got $80,000 in cash and no one will lock it up. He said, I don't care. I want to go to Tijuana. So I go down to this local hardware store and I buy some duct tape and I buy I've still got this bag. It's a little athletic bag. And I put that money in that bag and I tape it underneath the chest of drawers, $80,000. And me and Jim get in the car. We go down to Tijuana, Mexico, and spend the day there. And he says, I sure hope that money's there when we get back. So we try, and it is, you know. So I brought this $80,000 back to Missouri and handed it over to DEA for an administrative seizure, which later the rack told me, he says, man, that's one of the fishiest deals I've ever done. I said, hey, do you think I was going to leave him with it's drug money? I said, I don't care, give it back to him. But I said, I wasn't going to leave it with him. So anyway, I
Right.
seized $80,000 worth of drug money in California on that particular deal, which going back to the task force now, you know, between that, we found money in the truck that Cecil was driving. Then we drove out to Cecil's house. I mean, he did roll over and he'd say, dig here. And just right out in the middle of the yard, and we'd dig and we would come up with a 4-inch PVC tube capped on both sides, and it'd have $25,000 in it. And we did that 4 or 5 times. I mean, it was over $100,000 buried in his yard. So we seized all that money through administrative seizures, and it came back to the task force. So all at once, we had a lot of money. Not all of, you know, they keep a portion. I don't remember what the portion was, but
Right.
they allowed that money to go toward the task force to support the CMODO task force. So all at once, we didn't hurt for money.
Yeah. Man, that's a great start to the task force. So, kind of talk about the overall task force and how it grew from there and evolved.
Well, you know, it was really needed, and I don't think anyone really knew that. But at the same time, about the same time that happened, a year, maybe 2 years later, the U.S. Attorney's Office expanded into Cape. They did not have an assistant U.S. attorney or sitting judge over here at Cape. Everything was prosecuted on this side of the state in the Eastern District out of St. Louis. So
Hmm.
we didn't get a lot of support down here. We didn't get a lot of federal prosecution. Well, when they put this office in, of course, they're wanting to make a mark, and so we started filing a lot of federal cases. And so two things happened. Number one, within 3 years, within the third year, we were filing 20% of the cases, the CMO Drug Task Force, for the whole Eastern District of Missouri.
The
Now, think
entire,
about that for,
including St. Louis and
yeah,
all the
including
way.
St. Louis
Yeah.
and all those assistant U.S. attorneys up there and all the FBI agents and all the DEA agents and all the
Yeah.
ATF agents in the St. Louis region. This little task force down here is filing 20% of the cases for the whole Eastern District of Missouri. And
That's
today I was
major.
talking to Travis Tilmar just to expand on this slightly. They file their own cases now with the CMO Drug Task Force does. Travis Tilmar is the current coordinator. They file 40% of the cases for this office right here in Cape now. 40%, the task force does.
That's
So
astronomical.
that theme has not changed.
Yeah.
That's very impressive.
Yeah.
So along those lines, now I want you to stop and think about it. So one day I had this DEA agent call me from Texas, and he said, Alan, I want to know, I just arrested a bunch of guys on a conspiracy, and several of them were from Naylor, Missouri, Advance, Missouri, a couple from East Prairie. He said, why is that? He said, half of them are from, I said, because there's no prosecution down here. Because every one of those towns is on a county line. Even the troopers don't range all the way up to Advance or to Naylor. And you have this huge trucking industry in Southeast Missouri. So what
Mhm.
was happening was if you were a bad guy, if you were my definition of a criminal, a guy that gets up every morning and asks, what crime am I going to commit today? Would you want to live in St. Louis where you have all those assistant U.S. attorneys and all those federal agents chasing you? Or would you come down here to Southeast Missouri where you have understaffed sheriff's departments, where you have a state organization that really is geared to handle the highway, not to do You've got a limited number of state investigators that handle murders. So I'd come down here to Southeast Missouri and I'd be a bad guy down here. And that's exactly what was happening is you had the worst of the worst living right here in Southeast Missouri. And they were involved in smuggling all the way from Chicago down to the US Mexican border because there's no one to harass them until the task force came along and until the US Attorney's Office came along.
Wow.
That's really what happened.
Yeah, that's impressive. I did not realize the U.S. Attorney's Office kind of, formed down there in that time frame. That
Hmm.
that's interesting how that all unfolded. And I think that shows why it was so successful, why the task force was so successful. You have trained, competent, experienced narcotics investigators partnered with federal agencies and being able to present cases for federal prosecution. So
Yeah,
that's major.
yeah. And the task force, it manned up over time. I would get had a guy come in from the counties of Cape and Scott, and then I had enough money to hire independent task force officers like you.
Right.
Stacy Sims came in. He was an outstanding investigator. Eventually went to the patrol and then to DEA, but I was able to pay for them independently. So we had 12, 14 investigators at one point, and then I picked up Troop C, and we had a small task force in Farmington. But I had two troopers up there, and I had one trooper in up at the actually at the troop C, and they would come down. I have a meeting. They didn't like it at first. I make them come down every Monday, and we'd have a supervisor meeting, and then afterwards we would go play racquetball and go get a beer. And we did that for about 6 months because I wanted them to cohese as a team.
Mhm.
And at first they didn't like it, but then after a while they loved driving because it's put them out. I wasn't going to drive up there. I wasn't going to drive my team up there, so I made them drive down here,
Yeah.
and they absolutely loved it, and it did work. I mean, we would go up there, they'd put something together, we'd all drive up there and we'd do the deal, or they'd all drive down here and we'd do a deal. So it was a good cohesive team, not just here in Southeast Missouri, but all the way up into the St. Louis area.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you did such a good job with this that the patrol at some point, like they adopted or utilized your model with SEMO drug task force across the state, right?
Yeah, I think there's 5 task forces now, and they still use the same multi-jurisdictional agreement. It's a strong agreement in that it gives the patrol quite a bit of leverage. Unlike if you read some from other states, puts a lot of it in the sheriff's hands,
Mhm.
which there's nothing wrong with that except it splinters your authority. So if you've got good tactical control of a unit like that, you can really do a lot of good. And it is political. I mean, I was in to talk about the dark side of it a little bit. I mean, it was in the colonel's office probably once a year because some local sheriff or usually a sheriff was upset with how something went down here. And I kind of got to where I put the sheriff's numbers in my phone, and before something went down, I'd get them involved um, more and more. Some sheriffs I had to because they just would throw, and they'd go. What really upset my captain is they went above his head to the colonel's office, and
Mhm.
that just if they go to my captain, then it stayed in house, and my captain would handle it. But if they jumped above the captain, then it was not a good day.
Yeah, I would imagine. You know, working these types of cases, narcotics, and just these types of crimes in general, and dealing with these folks, it that affects a person and takes a toll on you. You described through your narcotics career how you're traveling so much and on the road, and your family doesn't know, your wife doesn't know where you are, or that type of thing. Would you want to talk about how, repercussions on your mental health and how that affects family and relationships? Would you want to discuss that briefly?
Yeah, it can be devastating and usually is to the home life and to marriages. We had 100% mortality rate in marriages in my first unit. Uh, we went through, I can remember we went through three sergeants in a very short time, two of them to death. One of them got disciplinary transferred. I can remember the captain coming back and saying, I can't find anybody who wants to supervise you guys. Can you supervise yourselves for a while? And really, again, Bob Asher stepped in, and even though he was a lieutenant, he stepped in and supervises. But it's what happens, especially the way we worked initially, it just wasn't. And that was one reason Terry and I wrote up, we need to change the structure because it was so devastating to the family. You became you unless you could take, and some people can do this, unless you can take that persona and set it outside when you walk in your house, and then be that that husband and that father. Um, then your family's going to suffer. And there's not many people that could do that. I mean, all you
Right.
wanted to do was work because there's a there's a there's a dopa effect there too. It releases this adrenaline, and you just want to keep doing it,
Mhm.
keep doing it. If you really want to drive a narc crazy, send him home for 2 weeks. He'll absolutely go crazy. And so
Yeah.
yeah, it was hard. They would send us to a police psychologist once a year, and supposedly, he said, "Now don't compare notes," and then later we'd say, "Well, are you crazy? No, are you crazy?" And I mean, it's just I don't even know how to put it into words, but it was uh, there was guys that were divorced and married two and three times. I divorced. There was a couple or three that made it through that hard time, and I honored them. I'm not quite sure how they did it. Um, because I didn't I was not a success there. I was not a success, and it wasn't good for my kids. It was hard on my kids. They're
Right.
they're fine today, but they had to suffer that. And I can remember some of the guys I talked to. Ed Moses is one of them. He said I knew that I needed to get out. He said after 5.5 years, he said I knew I needed to transfer back to the road. So there's guys that could see that what they needed to do and they did it. And you have to honor those guys too, that they did the right thing, and because you would take on this persona, and I would be out with the family and we'd be on vacation, and I would sign my undercover name at a hotel, not
Yeah.
even thinking I'd sign,
Yeah.
I mean that's just an example, but I can remember Mark James was my first supervisor, and he's kind of schooling me, and he says, "You don't think this will happen, but one of the things going to happen, you're going to be at Thanksgiving dinner one day with your family, and you're going to say, 'Hey, pass those effing potatoes down here.'" He said that'll happen, and that's not what happened to me. I was actually given a school presentation at a school up just north of here. It was in full uniform, and I used the F word right in the middle of an assembly. And I thought to myself, did I actually say that? And I could see everybody else in the room, the principal, the teachers, the students were saying, did he actually just drop the F bomb? I mean, it's just because
Yeah.
you live with these people and that becomes part of you.
Yeah. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. That's a spot on description there. I'd be curious to talk to you about and hear your opinions on, especially because of the time frame that you worked and how things are today. I'd be curious to know your thoughts on, the evolution of drugs like marijuana and the legalization of that, and take it a step further, maybe throw the phrase the war on drugs out there. Would you want to kick that around a little bit? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. If you look at what's going on from a bird's eye view, or what's gone on, or the history, I guess, um, we live in a free market, a capitalistic society that if there's a need, somebody's going to provide it. Okay, so it's just a set of circumstances. So you've got a poor country setting against a rich country. The median income in Mexico is about $18,000. Up here, it's over $80,000. So they've been smuggling something across that border for over a century. That's a
Mm.
long time. They've got it down. So what do you do about that? Well, you enforce the law. I mean, that's what we do, right? So if you look at your interviewees, the list of interviewees you've had, because I went through them, and 25 to 30% of them fought the cartel. They fought the Mexican
Right.
cartels. Why is that? We don't have that same situation at the U.S. Canadian border. Why? Because and that's the longest unguarded border in the world. And the reason is because that's a wealthy nation. So you don't have that dichotomy between a poor and okay. So okay, now let's look at marijuana. Okay, marijuana is a good place to start. So it's one of the most divisive issues in our society as far as should we legalize it? Should the government stay out of my business? Is it a medicine? I mean, you just go on and on and on
Right.
about, and I would let me say it like this. There's people that say we live in an attention economy, how we pay attention to something.
Hmm.
I would say we live in an addiction economy. The largest companies in the world are not oil, or they're not AI data, or they're not rare earth minerals. They are companies that provide a dopa hit. Think about that for a second. They're companies that provide, and I'm gonna use marijuana as an example. So why this addiction? Okay, why do we have addiction? So let's go back. It hasn't been that long ago that we as a civilization, it was more of a scarcity. We don't have enough salt, we don't have enough sugar, we don't have enough fat, we don't have enough approval, we don't have enough sex. So when we find those things, we overindulge. And when we overindulge, we get that dopamine release in the brain. It's just like a dog that doesn't know where its next meal comes from. It'll eat all the food you put out there. It'll eat every bit of it. It'll eat till it freaking rolls over. And I've
Yeah.
seen that happen with dogs before. But so the human's the same way. So what feeds that? So you've got alcohol, you got marijuana, you got uh, tech, you've got gaming, you've got all you. So the biggest companies are actually companies that are they're the picks and shovels that provide that watching reels or gaming or that. So
Yeah.
so okay, let's go back to marijuana. Here's an example. So let's use the state of Oklahoma. In the state of Oklahoma, which has an aggressive enforcement policy, they took out 3,000 marijuana grows last year. The Oklahoma Bureau of Narcotics did. Their industry there in their legalized state, there's 25 states in the United States that have legalized marijuana. There's 16 that have medicalized it. Um, their industry is somewhere between 120 and 240 billion dollars. Now they don't smoke that much marijuana. They actually provide most of the marijuana for the rest of the United States from the state of Oklahoma, even though they have heavy enforcement. They're also an oil producing state. They're number six in the nation in oil producing, where it's $55 billion. So their illegal marijuana is larger than their oil trade in that state. That's insane.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if I keep chasing this rabbit, and I'll stay on marijuana for a minute. There's 1,400 illegal dispensaries of marijuana in the state of New York. Illegal dispensaries in the state of New York. In California, it's two-thirds to a third. Two-thirds of the outlets are illegal, or two-thirds of the production is illegal. A third of it is apparently legal. And I would challenge that. So I see marijuana as a weapon of mass destruction because all it is doing is feeding an addiction. And you can use all these. What's going to happen one of these days is the same thing that happened to the tobacco industry. The lawyers sitting back watching, and when it gets to a certain point where there's enough money involved in it, they're going to sue the marijuana industry because there's plenty of information out there of how harmful it is to the body and harmful it is to society, and they're going to win. And they'll gut it just like they did to the tobacco industry. There's a doctor on the West Coast. His name was Daniel Amen, and he's a psychotherapist who's he's enamored with um, scans. He used SPECT. He said we're the only industry in psychotherapy. We're the only industry that doesn't scan the body for problems before we treat. Well, he uses that. He's been doing it since 1989. He has 11 clinics. He's done 80,000 scans since 1989. And he can tell you with 98% surety if you're using marijuana or not just by scanning your brain.
Wow.
So that tells you that's an unhealthy brain, right? That's
Correct.
just one example. That's just one place you can go to say that we have an addiction problem in this country. So
Yeah.
my take is that there's in a national policy program, there's three parts. There's enforcement, which you and I are in, and we're good at it. And it needs to be there. It's the right thing to do. It's in your face. But the other two parts, it's just like a three-leg stool, is education and treatment. Now, I don't have any expertise in either one of those. But if those aren't as strong in the drug policy program as your enforcement is, you're going to fail. We have an addiction problem in this country, and we're not addressing it. We have education that's upside down. We've told people that marijuana is a benign drug. We have 18 million people between the ages of 18 and 24 who are sitting in their parents' basements addicted to something, either pornography or gaming or whatever, while they chew on their gummies. 18 million, not 180,000, not a quarter million, 18 million people who could be out here adding to the common good. And instead, they're in their parents' basement with an addiction problem that they don't even know they have. Now, that's a problem. And we're not addressing that. You and I address the enforcement part. And as far as the war on drugs, it's kind of like Mark James said, there's not been a war on drugs until Donald Trump bombed those freaking cartel boats. That's a war.
Yeah.
So, I don't see any problem with going across the border and getting into it with them because they're not, obviously, they spend 20% of their GDP fighting the drug problem in the country, and obviously they lose. But if we didn't have an addiction problem in this country, there would be no smuggling across the Mexican US border. So
Yeah.
we're not going to be a success in this country until we take care of these two other legs of the stool. And we are so far from, and that's why I call marijuana a weapon of mass destruction. It's one of the most conflated issues in our society today. It is an extremely dangerous drug by any measure, and people don't research it. In fact, the other day I was listening to Joe Rogan argue with Ben Shapiro about who came up with these drug laws, trying to justify to Ben Shapiro, who was just sitting there like, "Hey, I get my juice. Everybody's got their dope, right? There's an old
All
saying,
right.
everybody has their dope. I get mine from the Bible." He wasn't for it or against it. But Joe
Yeah.
Rogan's sitting there trying to make a case on marijuana use, and to Ben Shapiro, it was the funniest thing I've ever seen. I thought you
I'm gonna
you
have to
got the
look that
wrong.
one up.
Yeah, it was pretty crazy. But the point is that we're failing. We're not failing at an enforcement level. We're failing at a holistic level of how to handle the addiction economy, and that's really what we have. So I say that if you want to, they talk about lost causes. Well, lost cause is a good cause because it's consequential. So you might not know anything about enforcement, but you might be able to help over here as a citizen in treatment. So jump on that, fight that part of it. Or maybe you're good at education. I talked about Ed Moses a while ago. Ed Moses came out of the undercover unit. They said, "What do you want to do? How do you want to transition back?" And he said, "Well, why don't you put me in the information system, in the information department and let me give drug programs for a year. And then I'll go back to the road." They said, "We'll do that." He stayed in that department for 7.5 years. He gave 300 programs, drug programs, a year for
Hmm.
7 years in a row. So that's where
Wow.
he chose to plant his standard.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd be curious, kind of springboarding off of this I'd be curious to know your opinion on this. You know, you said it earlier about purchasing an ounce of marijuana back in during your career, and I did the same, and we purchased even less quantities at times, and people were prosecuted for those charges and crimes. But now you can drive through a drive-through and buy ounces of marijuana and then do a U-turn or swing over and go to the drive-through at McDonald's like it's no big deal. After working narcotics like you did and seeing, you know, the availability of that, how does that make you feel? Do you know what I'm asking? We spent a career prosecuting people for possession of ounces of marijuana, and now it's so readily available. It's a common thing. I see, I have young kids and they're like, well, what is that building? What's a dispensary? What do you tell them after you've spent a career investigating that stuff? And now it's no big deal to
Well,
some
again,
people.
yeah, again, we're sending the wrong message. We should be telling our kids that, find a positive addiction. There's such a thing as a positive addiction. And find a different way to sandpaper off the rough edges at the end of the day rather than consume too much alcohol or chew your gummy or whatever. We're just sending the wrong message. As far as how I feel about it, um, I did what I could do where I was at with what I had at the time. And I think that's all you can do with the beliefs that I've got. And I still have those beliefs. I think you'll find in the law enforcement community that, we'll stand on a lectern and we'll say, this is wrong, what's going on, and we need to address it. And we need to be innovative, we need to be aggressive, and we need to stand our ground on those issues. And I still believe that. Um, I'm not going to change. I'm just not going to change
Yeah.
on that message. I think it's wrong for one president to say, "Well, I didn't inhale," and the next president comes along and says, well, "We're going to fight this fight," or vice versa. You had Reagan, who was a fought the drug dealers and the cartels and basically shut down the avenue, the cocaine avenue in Florida, south of Florida. He shut that down. Of course, it just moved over to Mexico, and they moved the cocaine
Right.
across for the Colombia cartels. But then you've got a guy that comes along and says, "I didn't inhale." That's not good for this country. It's just not.
Right. Right. Yeah. Great point. Let me ask this. I think we're kind of winding it down here. What, looking back on your career, you've done so many great things and so many interesting things. In your mind, is there one or two, I don't know, cases or events or moments or something that you're most proud of during your career with the Highway Patrol? Is that a fair question to ask?
Um, I was given an award by the division, which you're, which is it's actually given to you by your peers for the formation of the Southeast Missouri Drug Task Force. So that was probably looking back my best accomplishment and contribution. What I'd rather do is lean off and talk about the legacy, the lineage from the previous investigators that jumped out there and did it when they had no support, no infrastructure, no money, not the right cars. And then we moved to the long-term investigations where we had more support and but still yet the hours that we put in, endless hours, because you couldn't set up a system today like we partaked in at that time because of the hours. I mean, you left, I mean, how would you do that? You leave the house on a Monday and or Tuesday and you get back Saturday night. How do you compensate a person for that?
Right.
You couldn't do that today. So endless hours, and then at the sacrifice of your families. So I look back at the people that did those things, and that's who we owe the debt to. And there's been lots of narcotics investigators that has made more buys than me. That's made bigger cases. That's been more aggressive maybe than I was. But I certainly wouldn't take credit for being above average in the crowd that I ran in.
As I sit here, and it's one of the first things I noticed when we got on our video here today was your T-shirt, the Black Sheep T-shirt that you're wearing. Would you want to just briefly discuss what that is and what it means to you?
Yeah, I'm kind of proud of that. There was a time on the patrol when it's kind of like J.R. Poe, one of the old narcs. Used to say that the narcotics section is kind of like a garden. Sometimes it gets watered and fertilized, and sometimes there's a drought. We're not supported very well. And I guess it was during one of those periods that the four of the guys were together, Mark James and Joe Crump and Tom Gray and J.R. Poe, just those four. And they said, we feel like the black sheep. And so they bought some shirts and started, call themselves the black sheep. And then Joe said, maybe we should formalize this at least a little bit, and so the next year they brought Terry Mills in. That was in 1984. And then the next year, 1985, uh, Gary Wilson and I were inducted, and it just kind of continued from there. There's 17 members now in the Black Sheep, and it's kind of a group inside the group. There are Missouri narcs that probably should be in the Black Sheep that aren't. There's no hard and fast rules. I'm not even sure. You had to be a blue shirt. You had to be a trooper. We worked with some task force officers that were very effective, made lots of buys, great guys, good investigators, but they weren't blue shirts. They didn't go through the academy. And
Right.
the other requisite is that they have to be dope buyers. They have to be uh, consummate dope buyers. So that's two. It's a plus if you own a Harley and ride a Harley, but that's not that. Some of the guys don't have Harleys that are black sheep, but yeah, it's a special group of guys and one girl. We have Leanne Higginbotham is a black sheep. She's the only female in the group. But it's a special group of guys and girl that honor each other, I guess, in the sacrifices that they made and the time that they put in and the cases that they made. Yeah.
Good deal. That's interesting. That's got to mean a lot,
Mm.
that kind of goes to the camaraderie and of that group. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
Um, is there anything? I think we had a pretty good conversation here today. Is there anything that you'd like to circle back on, or anything to cover or comment on that I may have overlooked?
Let me add one person to, and I've brought his name up a couple of times, but one person that connects the old to the new is Mark James. He's a special person. He was there in the beginning. He was my supervisor in 1985. He left and did his stint with ATF, spent 30 years there, was a supervising um, the SAC in the Kansas City area. Um, he was tapped by the governor to be the DPS director. I believe it was Governor Blunt at the time. So he was the Department of Public Safety director, number one law enforcement officer in the state of Missouri. During that stint, when he left there, he became the U.S. Marshal in the Western District. Uh, and then currently he has been tapped by the governor as the DPS director. So this is his second stint. He's my age. I mean, he's 70 something years old. He's still in the game. He's been at it for 45 years now. His son's a trooper. But he connects the old with the new. He's a change agent. There's some people that don't like him much because sometimes changes. If you change, you have to let something go, which is hard, and you have to learn something new, which is also hard. So he's not favored by everyone, but he's definitely what Missouri needed and what the governor wanted. Very supportive, of course, of the Highway Patrol. So I would just like to mention Mark in my time here. It'd be the proper thing to do.
Sure. Well, thanks for sharing that. I appreciate that, and I'm sure listeners will find that interesting. Well, Alan, hey, I want to thank you for taking the time to sit down and share this, share your career, share what you are involved in, and almost just as importantly, share what others have done in law enforcement. And you've done a lot of good in this community, and I appreciate what you did in your career, and I appreciate you and thank you for sitting down and talking to me today.
Well, I appreciate you, Jim. I took you on in the task force a long time ago on a chance. You were the only guy that ever took in that didn't have a solid law enforcement background yet, and you've went on to prove yourself and prove that you could be a good, solid law enforcement officer that added to the common good. I got a couple of quotes here I'd close on
Yeah.
if
Yeah,
we have
please share
time.
them.
You kind of mentioned one earlier. Uh, I've been lucky enough to be with two different teams, but the initial undercover team that I worked with, and then the task force later. So I've been lucky to do this twice. The quote, maybe once in a lifetime, if you're lucky, happenstance will bring you together with a small group of individuals, and you and the group will accomplish something special. When it is over and finished, you will forevermore use it as a standard to measure all other accomplishments, relationships, and work, and they will all be lacking. So that's kind of how I feel about
Yep.
the first group that I worked with, and also the task force, the first members of the task force. And then the second one, these are in pictorials that I built years ago. And this is a quote: "You cannot choose your battlefield, the gods will do that for you. But you can plan a standard where a standard never flew." Unquote. Narcs look for trouble. They don't wait for a crime to be committed and react. They look for a criminal and give him an opportunity to commit a crime. Their aggressive nature and unorthodox methods make the criminal paranoid and the upper staff nervous. This brief pictorial represents 4 decades, at this time 5.5 decades, of patrol history related to narcotics investigation. The investigators in these pages initiated thousands of criminal investigations that caused the arrest of tens of thousands of criminals, many who victimized or would have victimized private citizens. To make that happen, they planted many standards where none had flown before.
That's impressive. That's impressive. That hits a nail on the head. Hey, I'm proud to know you, and I'm proud of all the work that you did, and I think that's appropriate to conclude our conversation for the day. So, Alan, thanks again.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Jim.
Yep. And let me transition to my listeners. And just once again, I want to thank you for following and all the comments and suggestions that you make to try and help me improve this podcast as I go along. So I appreciate you, the listener, as well. And just remind you that, please like, share, and subscribe to my social media so I can continue to bring you high quality guests like Alan Foust here. So thanks again. Thank you to the listeners.
Thank you.
The Right to Remain Silent podcast is brought to you by Streetwise 360 Studios. I would like to again thank today's guest for sharing the story right here on the podcast. Please remember to like, follow, share, and recommend us so that I can continue to bring you high caliber guests sharing their experiences just like we heard today. If your law enforcement agency is interested in training provided by Streetwise 360, or if you know someone that has an interesting law enforcement story to share, please contact me via the website, www.streetwise-360.com, www.streetwise-360.com.